Yes. Thank you, Sam.
Good morning. I am so happy to see you all. This is great. I would like to introduce our Dean, Randy Pinfield, and he's just going to come and offer you a few words of welcome.
Good morning. Let's do that again. Good morning. Got it. I have some notes here. I don't want to go too far off script. Thank you for being with us. This is really exciting. I think the last time I was here for a Cora call, Bomar, was maybe 4 years ago. It was before the pandemic, so it's great to be back here in person with y'all. First and foremost, we are thrilled that you're here with us today on behalf of Chancellor Gilliam, Provost Stores, all of us at UNCG. A warm welcome. Are there any folks in the room who are from outside of campus, like you're from another organization? Raise your hands up for me. All right. Thank you for being with us. This is really important. Can we do hands? Yes. This is the way I think about it. The more that it's ambiguous or murky as to where our campus ends and the broader community begins, the better, right? The more that we can interact and have you all here and we're out there, the better we can fulfill our mission. So thank you for being with us. All right. I know some might call it an interesting time for libraries. Would you call it interesting? Yeah, sure. Challenging. Let's do a multiple choice. Interesting, hands up. Challenging. All right, challenging. Maybe it's both, right? Real quick. What's one of the greatest challenges you're facing right now for libraries? Be it K-12, public libraries, institutions of higher ed. What's one of the greatest challenges you're facing? Austerity. Got it.
Advocacy.
Advocacy. Yep. Keep them coming. What else?
Genuine resources.
Budget and resources. Mike and I work together and I was going to respond. Yeah. Eroding trust. Censorship. Yeah.
It's all connected.
It's all connected, right? Huge challenges. How about workforce? Still need more and more folks, right? Coming in with the expertise. This is a super challenging time in many areas, libraries included. I know that you're feeling tremendous pressure, and I want to stress how important our Department of Library and Information Science here at UNCG is to every issue that was just raised, right? Every challenge that was just raised is being addressed by LIS here. So can we have a round of applause for LIS? We're super proud of LIS. Can I brag on them just a little bit? So first, this is our fastest growing department in the School of Education. It is one of the fastest growing departments on campus. It is over the past 6 years or so, it's about double, right? About twice the number of students. It's the only department in the School of Ed that has seen an increase in faculty over the past 6 years. That's really hard. We're on hard times here at ACG, right, in terms of the budget. So it's a testament to the work that LIS is doing and the growth that they've seen in enrollment. Let me give you a little bit more. The largest online program on campus, Lisa, do you know differently? It's the largest LIS, it's the largest online program on campus, 400-ish, upward 300 students. And I believe it's also the largest graduate program on campus. LIS, so they're doing fantastic stuff. A little more, its programs are ranked among the very top in the nation. And then when you think about public, in particular public R2 institutions, in a very elite class at the top. Not striving to be elite, or striving to be inclusive, but it's just one data point of the great things that are happening in LIS. I'm so proud of LIS, grateful for them inviting me to just spend a minute with you today. The best part of my remarks that I enjoy the most is this. It takes a village to put on an event like this. So let me recognize some individuals here. First, is Greg Hoffman here? Greg's not here. So thank you, Greg, wherever you are. Okay. Is Caitlin here? Caitlin, do you mind just saying that? And Caitlin, it's great to meet you. I don't think we've met in person. Tammy, where's Tammy? GA's here too. Okay, I'm gonna list names. Are they right out there? Can we pull them in for a second? Come on in, come on in. All right, so I'm going to say some names, but I don't know if they're all here. We have Talia, Sarah, Kate, Emily, Andrew, Chloe, Jerry, and Brittany. Did I leave anyone out? Can we do a round of applause? Our speakers and our panelists, I'm so grateful that you're with us today. Thank you for taking the time to do this. I know there's many other things you could be doing. And lastly, to all of you, thank you for taking the time for dialogue, for critical discussions around times that we're in, and for all of the work that you do supporting libraries around the state and the nation. Have a great day. Thanks. It's really important. LIS is doing great work. LIS is doing great work. If you want to support LIS, if you're passionate about LIS, you will see one of the ways you can do it is you provide some financial support to one of these on your table. It's a QR code. If you want to make a gift that makes you happy, a gift that makes you proud, don't be shy. Thanks.
Thank you, Randy. So I'm just going to add one word that he alluded to, but our school library program is ranked number 8 in the nation. If you haven't heard that, that is incredible. Oh, yes. We are at least in the top 5, and I expect we will get there. All right. I will, during lunch, I will talk with you a little bit more about the department and what's going on, and maybe why you consider making a small gift. But for right now, we'll just do a couple logistics, and then I just want to dive in and give it to Beth and give her plenty of time. So the restrooms, if you don't know, they're down the hall to the left. There's coffee in the back. Please feel free to get up during the program. I'm speaking for you, Beth, but I think it's fine if you feel free to get up and help yourself as we go along. So I have to make a choice here about seeing you or seeing the print. Beauty of old age, right? So I want to tell you a little bit about Cora Bomar. She was born in Memphis, Tennessee on September 8th, 1913. She died in Greensboro on March 18th in 2008 at the age of 94. She began her career as a teacher in rural Tennessee in 1932 and eventually became a leader and advocate for school libraries. Bomar was the recipient of numerous honors and awards on both the regional and national level. She was a strong advocate for libraries. She actually testified before the United States House of Representatives and Senate committees on 6 occasions. President Lyndon B. Johnson invited her to attend the signing of pro-library legislation in 1964. She served as president of the American Association of School Librarians from 63 to 64. And in 1966, she was appointed to the first director of North Carolina Division of Educational Media. School libraries and school media programs grew tremendously under her direction. And at the time of her departure in 1969, virtually every secondary and primary school in North Carolina had a central library. In 69, she joined our faculty, then the Library Science and Technology Department, and she remained until her retirement in 79. She lived her rest of her years in Greensboro, and she remained active in our department. And we are grateful that the funding that she endowed, that her family endowed, provides the funds of this station. So, welcome. All right. Dr. Elizabeth Wahler is the director of the School of Social Work at UNC Charlotte. She is a researcher, educator, and consultant. She was a social worker and has collaborated with individual libraries and large libraries to conduct needs assessment of their patrons' psychosocial needs and staff trauma-informed approaches to address their staff as well. She has presented widely on these topics, and she's just published a book, which she's going to tell you about. It looks great. I can't wait to read it. And so thank you so much for being with us, Ben. We really appreciate it. Please come.
Morning. Morning. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with all of you today and to talk about trauma-informed librarianship. It comes, my work in that area comes directly from these challenges that all of you are facing right now in libraries. So I'm going to start out by telling you a little bit about myself and how I came to this work, because sometimes people are like, you're a social worker. How are you working with libraries? Why are you working with libraries? So I sort of fell into this work by accident. I was a social worker for about 14 years in Kentucky originally, that's where I'm from. And I worked for all of that time with people who had poverty-related challenges and had mental health problems, substance use disorders, were experiencing intimate partner violence, or had lots of different barriers to economic mobility and stability. And so I worked for years, and the whole reason I went back to get my PhD is that I always found myself really frustrated that the interventions and the organizations that we had for mental health problems, for substance use disorders, for all of these kinds of challenges, really didn't meet the needs of people who had poverty-related barriers, poverty-related stress and strain, and people were falling through the cracks left and right. And so I went back to get my PhD because I wanted to have a better way of helping people that have these kinds of challenges. So I got my PhD in social work. I went to work for Indiana University, where I was for 9 years until coming to Charlotte about 1.5 years ago. And when I was in Indiana, I moved into administrative roles. I was actually the master's program director at the time, and the Indianapolis Public Library approached us, the university, and said, please give us some social work student interns. We need help. And beginning then was when I actually learned about all of the challenges that were happening in public libraries. I wound up working with that library doing a needs assessment. We piloted social work students in their downtown branch. We continued collecting data to eventually allow them to justify hiring a full-time social worker in their library, which they have now. And we started publishing and presenting on the work that was going on in Indianapolis, and libraries started coming out of the woodwork everywhere, across the country, even internationally, talking about very similar challenges. And it became my main focus, and it overlaps very closely with my practice experience as a social worker, because most of what we're seeing in especially public libraries, but also in school libraries, academic libraries, some special libraries, we're seeing these growing psychosocial needs of the patrons, so growing mental health concerns, substance use concerns, poverty-related challenges. We're seeing the result of those challenges on the staff, causing great staff stress and trauma in many cases. And it overlaps with my work as a social worker when I was. So for the last 7 or 8 years, this has been my main area of research. I started working with libraries, specifically looking at how they could address patron needs. And then over the years, my work has really transitioned to focus sometimes on patron needs, but largely on staff and how we can boost the capacity of staff to deal with the things that are happening in libraries today. I also work with some libraries that are adding social work components or programs. And then I often work with libraries that do not have social work and probably never will have social work, but need other strategies for supporting their staff and their patrons. So I have a consulting business now focused on helping libraries. I do work with some statewide libraries, small libraries, kind of everything in between. I have a book coming out in September, co-authored with Sarah Johnson, who is a librarian and a social worker. And we wrote this book to try to help give libraries strategies for addressing the needs of high needs patrons while also supporting their staff. So the title that the publisher went with really focuses on the patron side, but we actually dedicated a huge chunk of the book to strategies that libraries can do to support staff as well. So today we're going to talk about trauma-informed librarianship and trauma-informed services and ways that that can help staff as well as helping patrons of libraries of all kinds. We're going to start out by talking about some of these changing patron needs that have impacted libraries today. We're going to talk about trauma and its prevalence, how trauma impacts libraries, and then we're going to talk about the guiding principles of trauma-informed care and how those look in the context of a library. So have any of you ever been to a training on trauma-informed care in general? See, a few people. Have you been to a training that's specific to libraries? I see one hand. Yes, generally, trauma-informed trainings in general focus on mental health providers, social services, all of these other different contexts. And sometimes libraries then have trouble picturing how this looks in a library, how this can impact services and programming in a library. So that's what the focus today is going to be, specific to the context that all of you are in. So I'm going to use the term psychosocial needs. And when I talk about psychosocial needs, I'm talking about things like the social determinants of health, things that we know impact stress and strain in general populations, everywhere around the world. So these can be any psychological or social or environmental factor that is associated with high stress or high strain for people experiencing them. There are things like social isolation, mental health problems, substance abuse, and poverty-related needs like difficulty accessing transportation, housing instability or homelessness, financial needs, food insecurity, things like that. So that's what I mean when I say psychosocial needs. So there have been a number of changes that have happened in the US specifically over the past few decades that have impacted people who are coming into libraries everywhere. And it started really back in the 60s with the deinstitutionalization movement. So that movement, that changed how we treated people with mental health problems in our country. So before this time, anybody who was deemed to have some sort of psychiatric problem, and that definition was much wider then than it is today, was often put in an inpatient facility and sometimes for decades or their entire life. So people lived in hospitals that had mental illness. In the 60s, though, there had been a growing awareness that a hospital, an inpatient facility, is not where people thrive usually. In fact, people were often getting worse when they were in the hospital for a long period of time. And that people do better when they're in a social environment with their friends, with their family, when they're able to be productive, when they're working, when they can, feel like they're taking care of their own needs. And so there was a movement to close many of the psychiatric institutions and get people out in communities. The problem with that all sounds, fine and good to most of us, but the problem with that is that there were never enough resources to support people in communities then. So people with severe mental illness sometimes are then in communities where they can't access mental health care, they don't have assistance with employment, they don't have assistance with housing, they're not able to sustain themselves without some extra assistance, they're not able to get the care they need. And so that is when we started seeing a huge increase in people with serious mental illness who were also homeless and living on the streets for long periods of time, sometimes most of their adult life. And that continues today, where we see people, there's often a huge overlap. Not every person who's experiencing homelessness has a mental illness, but many people with severe mental illnesses are also homeless. We also have seen a number of kind of ups and downs economically in this country that have impacted the people, including all of us in this room, and our financial states. Started really when we saw libraries really impacted by this, the Great Recession, the mortgage crisis around 2007, 2009. At that time, we saw people really struggling to afford housing, people who had an increase in poverty-related challenges, needed food, needed assistance, paying for other things in their life because of struggling with paying for housing, or and we also saw an increase in people who became homeless because of this. We don't have enough emergency shelter beds throughout our country. So even for people who are experiencing homelessness who want to be in shelter, there are not enough places for them to be sheltered. They often are just left out on the street trying to find a safe place for shelter on their own. We also have seen an increase in inflation, right? We've seen an increase in costs, yet we've seen stagnant wages, which again impacts all of us in this room. The minimum wage has stayed $7.25 an hour since 2009, although the cost of living has greatly increased from that time. In fact, the estimated current living wage for somebody to be able to afford their basic needs here in North Carolina, for a single adult with 0 children, they need to be making $16.83 an hour. If they have 1 child, it goes up to $35.73 an hour to be able to pay for their basic needs comfortably. 2 children, it goes up to $46.40. So when we look at the difference between that living wage and what the minimum wage is, there's a huge discrepancy. So again, we have people who are working, who are the working poor that don't have enough to pay for their needs. And that impacts who's coming into libraries of all kinds. We also have seen an increase in municipal statutes across the country that criminalize homelessness. So over the past decade in particular, we've seen a growth in laws and regulations in many cities around the country that prevent people from panhandling, prevent people from loitering on the street, prevent them from sleeping somewhere publicly. And again, that shapes who needs to come into public libraries in particular, where we're seeing, especially in urban areas, there's a huge number of people who are experiencing homelessness who are coming into a library every day to try to have a safe place to sit down and rest and stay for a while. And then we also have the COVID pandemic. So over the past few years, that's impacted so many people in terms of increasing poverty-related needs. We've seen an increase in mental health problems. We've seen an increase in child abuse and partner violence, substance abuse. We've also just seen an increase in behavioral challenges, and that definitely is impacting libraries, and challenges that have nothing to do with mental health, but we've just seen an increase in incivility and people who are confrontational and aggressive in the way they handle things. So the pandemic has brought definitely a growth in different challenges for all libraries. Here in North Carolina, we have a higher poverty rate than the country as a whole. So poverty rates here in 2021, 13.4% of the population in North Carolina was at or below the poverty level. In 2021, that means that they had to be below this income. So the poverty level for a family with 4 was $26,500 or less. So again, when you think about that living wage that we talked about, 13.4% of the population was below this income, but there is also a huge group of people who made more than this that aren't captured in this statistic, but they're still not able to pay for these needs. We also have problems with housing insecurity and homelessness here, and it depends on what city you're in or what county you're in. But here in the state in 2020, the last point in time count of people who are actually living on the streets homeless or in homeless shelters found that over 9,000 people were homeless on any given day here in the state. This count is always considered to be an underreporting, because when they do this annual point in time count, it's whoever they can find that day. But there are lots of people who don't get counted. We have a current shortfall of 200,000 affordable rental homes in this state, which is a significant number. So there are many people who can't afford housing. And of people who actually are renting housing, 25% of renter households in the state are considered extremely low income, and 69% of that group pays more than 50% of their income for rent. So again, that leaves very little income for other things that they need, like food or transportation. Here in North Carolina, the entire state is considered a designated shortage area for often multiple kinds of healthcare. So I know you can't see very well, but the kind of orangey yellow counties, the majority of the state, are designated shortage areas by the federal government for primary care, dental care, and mental health and behavioral health care. So almost the whole state does not have an adequate amount of dental providers, primary care providers, mental health providers, substance abuse treatment providers for the population here in the state. And even the counties that aren't that orange are a shortage area for at least one of those types of healthcare. So the kind of pinkish red counties are designated shortage areas for dental health and mental and behavioral health care. Light blue are shortage areas for both primary care and dental health. And the really light colored counties are shortage areas for dental health only. So, but the whole state doesn't have enough providers for the population. So all of these things that are happening in our state and in our country as a whole are impacting the populations of people that are coming into our libraries. They're impacting not only public libraries, but also the population of children that we're seeing in school libraries, the populations of college students that we're seeing in academic libraries. This has really impacted every population that we're seeing across multiple kinds of libraries. Most of my research to this point is focused on public libraries, but I do get calls and consultation with other kinds of libraries as well. So most of the data I'm going to share is really specific to public libraries, but I'll just say again that it really applies to almost every kind of library. The top areas of public library patron needs that we're seeing are homelessness or unsafe and unstable housing, and that's across rural and urban libraries. It really doesn't matter. Although in urban libraries, we tend to see more people who are chronically homeless, and the people that we see who are often living on the streets. In rural areas, homelessness often looks a little different. People who might be couch surfing or staying with others temporarily, but we do see homelessness and housing instability in all kinds of communities. We see mental health challenges, one of the top areas of patron need in libraries. Substance use and overdose is a quickly growing area of need, with many libraries having significant problems with patrons who are using substances. They're under the influence of substances in the library and often even overdosing grounds for this. And we also see a huge growth in poverty-related needs in general. The areas of need that we're seeing vary based on housing status. So in libraries that do have greater numbers of patrons who are experiencing homelessness, those libraries also see greater numbers of people with significant mental illness and mental health problems and substance use problems as well. Libraries that serve lower numbers of people experiencing homelessness tend to see less of all of these things, although they do still see patrons of all of these kinds of needs. These needs have continued to increase with the COVID pandemic and are expected to continue to increase over these coming years. So things aren't going to get better anytime soon, which is not the news that any of us want to hear, I know. And now, although the frequency of needs varies, so again, some libraries see more of these things than others, these are all needs that we're seeing in patron populations in all kinds of libraries again, and all kinds of communities, urban, rural, and suburban. Many of these needs that we're seeing are trauma related. So we're going to talk about that in a minute, but I put in parentheses, the other piece that's really important is that serving people with many of these needs can also cause trauma for staff. So when I talk about trauma in general, I'm talking about trauma in a really broad sense. So trauma can be things like people experiencing some sort of assault, or being in active combat, or being a victim of interpersonal violence. They can be things like that. They also can be things that are more chronic in basis. We see people who sometimes have serious medical events that are traumatic for them. And we'll talk about kind of how things are defined as traumatic in a minute. Anything that's life-threatening or really scary, where people are in fear of their safety or someone else's safety around them, can be trauma. And 70% of adults in our country have experienced at least one traumatic event in their lifetime. Many people have experienced multiple traumatic events. We also sometimes categorize trauma that has happened to people as a child in a separate category, ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. So ACEs can include any of those things on the previous slide that can be traumatic, but also things that impact a child's sense of safety or overall security. So if something happens to a child that maybe wasn't directly involving them, but their parent got incarcerated, or they had to move a lot, they didn't know where they were going to be or where they were going to stay. All of those things can be traumatic experiences, particularly for children, because they impact their sense of safety and security in the world. 61% of adults in the US report experiencing at least one of these ACEs before they turn 18, and 1 out of 6 adults report experiencing at least 4 or more of these. So when we look at the general population, many of us have experienced traumatic events of some kind, either as a child or as an adult. And again, many people have experienced multiple traumatic events, and these impact us all in different ways. So for something to be designated as trauma, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA here in the US, says that there has to be 3 things. They use a 3E framework to understand trauma. So the first of it is that there has to be some kind of event. There has to be something that happens to us that then we experience in a negative, frightening, really scary way. And it has some sort of effect on us after the fact. And different people experience things differently. So this is why when you're working in the library, one staff member may be really traumatized by something that happens in the library, while somebody else, to them it wasn't that big of a deal. They went on with their day, it didn't bother them that much. Same thing outside of libraries. We experience things differently. But something that's traumatic for one person might not be traumatic for another, which is really important to remember. Trauma is very personal. All demographic groups experience trauma. But we do see some demographic groups that are more likely to experience trauma than others, or may experience more chronic traumas, mostly because of discrimination and bias and things that happen because of discrimination and bias. So when we look at statistics about people who've experienced trauma, people of color, women, people who are trans or non-binary or other gender diverse groups, people living in poverty, and people experiencing homelessness are more likely to experience trauma and multiple traumatic events compared to their counterparts. Since libraries of all kinds, again, serve the public and serve a wide range of people, you can assume that many people you see every day in your work have experienced trauma of some kind, and many people that you work with as colleagues have experienced trauma of some kind. We have to remember that trauma experiences and trauma responses vary greatly among people. And trauma responses of any kind are really just our body and our brain's way of trying to adapt to something that happened to us that was really abnormal and really scary. So it's our adaptation to our circumstances. And these modifications and adaptations that happen to us in response to trauma can impact us sometimes for our entire lives. They affect us and our behavior for years to come, and sometimes for our whole lives. And we also have to remember that the impact of trauma is cumulative. So people, again, that have experienced multiple traumas are more likely to have a greater trauma response. We can probably see behaviors and see things that they may be doing that are impacted directly from trauma more than somebody that may not have had as much trauma in their life. I know nobody here can see this with this slide, so I'll kind of walk you through what's on here. This shows the different kinds of trauma responses and affects the trauma that people experience. So on the upper right, it's talking about cognitive functioning. So many times trauma and experiencing trauma impacts our cognitive functioning, our ability to remember things, our ability to concentrate, our ability to learn and retain new kinds of information. Moving down kind of clockwise, it talks about our physical and mental health. So people are often more likely to have physical health problems if they've experienced trauma, and then certainly mental health problems like anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation. At the bottom right, it talks about our perception and beliefs. So experiencing trauma really changes the way people view the world, specifically how safe they feel in the world or how trusting they feel with other people. So people who've experienced trauma may walk around in life feeling very unsafe around other people in general, and they may have difficulty trusting or feeling comfortable around you or around your libraries. On the bottom left, it talks about relationships. So experiencing trauma can impact our relationships with other people. Again, it can impact our ability to trust others, to feel comfortable with people, to read social cues, or to be able to say how we're feeling and express that to somebody that we're in some kind of relationship with. And then on the top left, it talks about emotional regulation. So people who've experienced trauma often have difficulty regulating their own emotions. They may be really moody or irritable. They may be quick to escalate. They may have trouble calming themselves or coping with things that are happening. And all of these are really normal trauma responses for people. Sometimes we see people who have experienced trauma who go on to develop PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, PTSD is a very specific diagnosis based on a specific set of symptoms people have. Most people who experience trauma do not go on to actually develop PTSD. So even if you see somebody who doesn't have PTSD, it doesn't mean that they don't have many other effects or impacts from that trauma. But PTSD is when people experience intrusive thoughts or flashbacks to what happened sometimes. They may have nightmares about the trauma that happened. They tend to be what we call hypervigilant, which means they're always on edge, they're easily startled, they're just waiting for something to happen again. And so there's a whole set of diagnostic criteria for somebody to have PTSD. But what I want to make sure comes across is that we see so many people that have trauma responses and changes to their behavior that don't have PTSD. People are more likely to develop PTSD if they've experienced previous traumas in their life, if they have a personal or family psychiatric history, if they have poor social support, if they were actually injured physically as part of the trauma that happened, if they had childhood adversity or ACEs that had experienced. The initial severity of their trauma response impacts how likely they are to then be diagnosed with PTSD later. And then demographic factors are associated with PTSD, specifically people who have lower education levels, lower socioeconomic status, and then female gender are more likely to later be diagnosed with PTSD. So in libraries, what we tend to see from people who have experienced trauma, and all of this depends on the type of trauma somebody has experienced, the severity of the trauma, what age they were when that trauma occurred. So again, people have different responses. But we tend to see people in a library who have difficulty with social interactions, people who have difficulty reading social cues, they can't tell that you want them to stand back a little bit, they can't tell that their voice has escalated a little bit, they have trouble telling when people are irritated or not welcoming their behavior or what they're doing or saying. We also see people who become really irritable quickly, or they're easily escalated, or the tiniest thing that happens can set somebody off. That is a normal trauma response. We see people who sometimes want to stay isolated. So they come into the library, they want to be left alone, they don't want anybody to talk to them, but also vice versa. We sometimes see people who are overly social come in every day and they want to talk to you, and they want to talk to you all day, and they really don't pick up on the fact that you need to talk to somebody else or do something else right now. We see people who use drugs and alcohol. That is a really normal trauma response. Again, there's a huge overlap. And again, not everybody who has substance abuse problems has had trauma, but the overlap is really high. About, I think the latest research indicates about between 90 and 95% of people with substance use problems have had some kind of trauma that has impacted their substance use. We see people who want the library to be really quiet, and they get annoyed by noises easily. But again, we see the opposite sometimes. People want chaos, they want noise, they sort of create that chaos everywhere they go. So those are two different ends of the same continuum of the trauma response. We see people who become really angry when things go as unplanned or something unexpected happens. And we see people with inappropriate sexual behaviors in libraries, which is becoming a huge problem and has been a huge problem in many public libraries in particular. Inappropriate sexual advances, flirting, or sexual behavior. Do these things sound familiar for many of you? These are really common behaviors of people in libraries. Now, we know that these things impact the staff that are working in libraries. And for a long time, the focus was really on patrons and how libraries could better serve patrons. But what we have learned with recent research, the Urban Library Trauma Study, that came out last year. There have been some other studies on what library staff are experiencing. We're seeing a huge increase in staff who are experiencing firsthand experiences of trauma in the library. But then, since we talked about the demographics of trauma, we also know there are a lot of library staff who experience trauma outside of the library as well. But library workers are often impacted by firsthand experiences of trauma in the library, from violence that's happening, threats that are happening, seeing somebody else be harmed in the library. We also are seeing something called secondary or vicarious trauma that's impacting library staff, and then burnout. These are separate things. So the recent literature says that frontline library staff from all kinds of libraries and all kinds of communities, urban, suburban, and rural, report high rates of trauma from workplace incidents. And over half report experiencing actual violence in their jobs. And this is specifically related to public libraries and all kinds of communities. Incidents include verbal abuse, having people come in who are physically aggressive, who destroy property, who are throwing things, bringing in weapons, threatening with weapons, or actually assaulting people in the library. These incidents have increased since the COVID pandemic began, and again, they seem to continue to be increasing. These incidents can cause library staff to experience symptoms of or worsening of a pre-existing mental health condition. We also see many libraries impacted by something called institutional betrayal. So institutional betrayal was a term coined by psychologist Jennifer Freyd, who originally started looking at college and universities and people who experienced, her first work looked specifically at people who had experienced a rape or a sexual assault on a college campus or university campus. She then really applied her learning to many other areas, and it applies directly to libraries as well. What this means is that people who are harmed in the context of their work with a specific institution, so in this case, in their work with a library, when they're harmed as a result of their work with that institution, the actual trauma they experience is made worse by this sense of betrayal, that they were not protected by the institution, that the institution didn't respond appropriately after the fact, they didn't feel supported. And what we see is that people are impacted by the trauma that they experienced first, but then the symptoms they have, the experience they have is magnified if the library, in this case, does not respond to what happened, does not respond in a sympathetic kind of way, doesn't respond in a way that tries to look at whether policies need to change or practices need to change to prevent that harm from happening in the future. So this is a big piece. If any of you read the Urban Library Trauma Study, they don't talk about the term institutional betrayal, but they do talk about people who were harmed because they felt like their library administration didn't respond to what happened to them, didn't support them. And we do see again that trauma response is then magnified, it lasts longer, and it's often greater for people who have that sense of institutional betrayal. So this is really impacting libraries today, that we're not set up in a way, libraries they're not social service organizations, right? Like they're not set up in a way where there are natural supports for staff who experience trauma. But libraries are quickly trying to adapt to be able to support staff. And actually a large part of my consulting work right now is focused on supporting staff and need assessments with staff and figuring out strategies that libraries can do to better respond to staff trauma and prevent it in the future. Libraries are also impacted by secondary or vicarious traumatization. So this is a term that means that we may not experience the trauma firsthand, but we can actually have a trauma response based on working with people who've been traumatized. So in many libraries, the people who work in libraries are very kind, empathetic, caring, compassionate people who want to make a difference. And having that sort of personality, that want to make a difference and help, and interacting with people who have been highly traumatized themselves can actually lead to a trauma response for the person that's trying to help. And we are seeing that with staff reports and some of the needs assessments and the research on staff, that many people are experiencing that they may not have experienced the trauma firsthand. They are feeling depressed. They are having changes in their own behavior based on the work that they're doing with people in the library. The risk of developing secondary traumatization is greater for people who are really caring or empathetic by nature. It's also higher for people who don't have adequate training to deal with traumatized people, which again, that's almost every library. People are working with traumatized people who don't have the training to work with that particular population. So what we see in staff behavior from staff who've experienced trauma, we see staff who describe feeling really burned out. We see staff who are depressed, who feel like they're no longer really effective at work. We see people who dread coming into work, or they may start calling in sick frequently. We see people who isolate, they don't want to talk to their coworkers. We see staff who are frequently irritable, they hate dealing with people or hate working with people. They may lack creativity, even though they once were really creative, they can't seem to access that anymore. They may have difficulty with concentration, difficulty with sleeping. They may use unhealthy coping mechanisms like drugs or alcohol themselves, or overeating, or other types of unhealthy coping mechanisms. And sometimes we see staff who have poor boundaries with other people. These are really normal trauma responses for staff who are experiencing trauma. We also see burnout, which is actually a distinct concept or idea. Sometimes people talk about being burned out as a feeling related to trauma, but burnout is its own concept. And it actually means that it's a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. There have to be 3 different components for somebody to actually be considered burned out. Those are feelings of exhaustion, increased negativity or cynicism about the job, and then reduced effectiveness at work. The risk of being burned out is impacted by lack of control at work, by somebody else just sort of telling you what you need to do, and you don't have much control over that. Lack of adequate job resources, which is impacting libraries where budgets are being cut and people don't have the resources to do what they really want to do or need to do. Unclear job expectations or unclear roles can increase burnout. Having dysfunctional work dynamics, being isolated and lacking social support, and that's at work or home, and then having a work-life balance. Now, some of these things are individual factors that a person can do to try to cope with work. Most of these, though, are structural and systemic factors that come from the workplace. So that's what I want to make comes across. What I want to make sure comes across today is that we can actually change things about the workplace that then will decrease the chances that staff will burn out. When people are burned out, it results in low morale and disengagement and just people that really are not motivated to do their work. So when we talk about all of these things, firsthand trauma, secondary traumatization, burnout, all of these things are really complex, interconnected issues which require broad organizational strategies to cope with and deal with. So one of those strategies is actually working and trying to develop a trauma-informed library. I'm trying to monitor the time. So in a trauma-informed library, we keep in mind, first of all, how prevalent trauma is, and we always keep in the front of our mind that everybody we're dealing with could have experienced trauma, and really the majority of people have experienced this sort of trauma. We make sure that all of the staff in our library and everybody that's working in our library, volunteers, everybody recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma, because that helps increase some empathy. It helps us kind of make sense of things that are happening that sometimes appear to be bizarre or strange, which then changes our response to it. We respond to this knowledge of trauma by integrating this knowledge into our behavior and changing our own policies and practices in response. We focus on being sensitive to the traumatic experiences of other people, working really hard to not re-traumatize anybody. So we change our policies and practices to make sure that we're not contributing to trauma for people. And we learn to look at everything through this lens instead of asking what's wrong with this person for them to be acting like this. We instead kind of keep this framework in mind where we think, what happened to this person to make them act like this today? And again, that little shift, that's a subtle shift, but it impacts our overall ability to have empathy with the person and be able to respond in a more passionate, a more compassionate and patient way with them. And our focus is not just on patrons and staff. So when we're working to have trauma-informed library, we keep in mind that this applies not just to the people that are walking through our doors that we serve, but also our coworkers and colleagues and our staff. The benefits of integrating and developing and implementing a trauma-informed approach are really broad and varied. But overall, it creates a healthier organization for everybody, not just our patrons, but our staff, ourselves. It just creates a better, more positive organization where people feel like they have a voice in things, people feel valued. It prevents re-traumatization, so that can reduce the need for people to actually seek mental health care or need mental health services. It can help enforce our mission as a library to be a welcoming place for everybody. It's been found to reduce the number of escalating events or the number of times there has to be discipline or disciplinary actions for people. And it increases overall morale, communication, and shared decision-making, and ultimately overall satisfaction of everybody that's interacting with us in our space. Becoming a trauma-informed library is not something that we do. It's not a destination where you get to it one day and you're there. It really is this ongoing process, and it takes intention and dedication to try to be a trauma-informed library and stay a trauma-informed library. There are 6 different principles of trauma-informed care. I'm going to talk about how each of these looks in a library environment. So the 6 principles are safety, trustworthiness, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, cultural, historical, and gender issues. I'm going to talk about each one of these. So a trauma-informed library works to make sure that those 6 principles are clear and present in the practices that they have as a library, in their policies, their procedures, and really just their overall approach. So the first is safety, and this means not just physical safety, but also psychological safety. So a library that is really trying to demonstrate this principle of trauma-informed care makes sure that the facility itself is as clean and well lit and taken care of as much as possible so that it's physically safe, that exits are marked, that there are policies in place to try to make sure that people are safe or as safe as possible in the library. And although we can't 100% guarantee safety because we never know who's coming through our doors, we also have policies in place and we make sure people are prepared to react consistently and swiftly when there is something that comes in that impacts safety. So it's about trying to maintain a physically safe environment and make sure that we can get back to physical safety as quick as possible when there is a threat to safety. But it's also the psychological safety piece. So it's making sure that we have a library where people feel free to voice their opinion, to be themselves, to be whoever they are, that they feel welcomed, that they feel like you care about them, they feel cared for, and that you really focus on the relationships. It's a person-first kind of approach where you focus on relationships and making sure that people feel valued and safe to be themselves and have a voice in the process in your library. The second principle is trustworthiness. So this means that your library states the values and then lives out those values every day, that you make sure that the policies and practices match and are consistent with what you say you are about or what you say you're going to do. It means that we're transparent in our actions, we're transparent in our decision-making processes, we let people know why we've made decisions we've made. We want people to trust us as an institution and also trust us as individuals in the library. For decision-making in libraries to have trustworthiness, we typically see shared decision-making processes where people are invited to share their opinions. We make decisions in a really transparent and clear way. So they give feedback and they know why we've decided to do what we're doing. The third guiding principle of trauma-informed care is peer support. So in a library, this means we create a system where people at all levels have an opportunity to learn from one another, work together, collaborate together, and to learn from people who've been there, done that with whatever it is that they're working on. So in libraries, this applies to patrons and staff. So patrons, libraries are really good at creating lots of different ways for patrons to interact with and support one another. We bring people together based on shared concerns, shared needs, shared interests, right? So for patrons, we can add or offer mutual aid groups. So I'm seeing a growing number of libraries, and some academic libraries, often public libraries, some school libraries, that are adding peer support groups for different for different kinds of needs for patrons. So these aren't clinical groups, it's not therapy, just opportunities for people to come together and connect in the library space around something that's of concern to them. We also often see libraries that are highlighting books that are written by authors that have firsthand experience with what they're writing about, right? So that people can pick up a book by somebody that has a mental health challenge or was homeless and has exited homelessness or whatever, had cancer and survived cancer. But highlighting books by people that have, or other resources by people that have lived experience as a way of trying to build in this peer support for patrons. On the staff side, though, this is often where libraries have not traditionally had these kinds of supports for their staff. But staff can benefit from having mentoring relationships or having peer support groups. So we're seeing more and more libraries add some sort of staff support group, an opportunity for staff to come together and talk about and process some of the stressful things that are happening. We're also seeing a growth in something called reflective practice groups, which reflective practice is something that comes from social services, education, nursing, many of the other helping professions, where in reflective practice groups, you have an opportunity to process what's happening and process the stress. But part of coming together is not just the venting piece and processing, it's also looking at what happened. Can we make sense of that? Can we figure out from this, what do we need to do to prevent this from happening again? Did I make some mistakes? I didn't know exactly what to do. What information do I need to avoid that mistake in the future? So it's an opportunity to process, but then also develop strategies for preventing a challenge in the future. So we're seeing more and more libraries add reflective practice groups, as well as just peer mentoring or support groups. And just creating opportunities for staff to gather around common interests is important. The next guiding principle of trauma-informed care is collaboration and mutuality. So this is just operating from this framework where we remember that we are all in this together. We sort of rise or fall together, right? And that we heal, progress, and thrive through the power of relationships with one another. So in a library, this means that we see administration and staff using person-first language, a relationship-first approach, a solution-focused approach. Like keeping in mind shared goals. What is it that we all want together and how can we get there? Reframing things that are problematic behavior to really understand again what may have happened to somebody to make them be behaving the way they are. But kind of operating from this framework where we remember that we're really no different from the other people that we're working with, the people that we're serving. And if we had had that set of challenges that they had, we could be in their shoes as well. So it's sort of operating in that framework. Again, trying to create mechanisms for shared decision-making, collaborative processes, so that we're not working in a hierarchical structure, but instead we have opportunities for people at all levels of staff, all levels with our patrons, to have a voice and have input in what we're doing so that we are making collaborative decisions and choices moving forward. The next guiding principle of trauma-informed care is empowerment, voice, and choice. So this is really closely related to the previous one on collaboration and mutuality. But this is where we're really intentional about creating opportunities for everybody to have a voice. And we make sure that we're not making decisions in a top-down sort of way, but instead those decisions are informed by people who are going to be impacted by whatever decision we're making. So we specifically focus on making sure that patrons from oppressed or marginalized groups, that we're seeking out input and their voices in the things that we're doing. We try to ensure diversity among our staff, which I know has been a challenge in the library field. We try to ensure diversity in our board members and in people who will be really making decisions for the library and other kinds of decision-making groups. We give patrons a choice of services and programs that might be helpful to them rather than just offering a program that we think might be helpful. Try to get input to guide what we're doing. We remind people of choices they have, even when we have to enforce a policy. So this is something that I actually often train on. People want to know how to set boundaries or enforce policies with people in a trauma-informed way that will decrease the chances that somebody will escalate or something will become violent or become greater than it was. And the number one way we do that is by actually giving people choices, even when we have to empower, even if we have to enforce a policy. So often there's a way, if we think creatively about it, where we can give people a choice. Now the choice may be they have to leave our library if they're going to do something, but just reminding people of choices they have can actually be really empowering to them. And then the last guiding principle of trauma-informed care is cultural, historical, and gender issues. So this means that we are always mindful of how all of us are impacted by the lens we have due to our culture, due to our history, due to our gender, due to different demographic factors that impact us. And those different contextual factors can impact how we are viewing somebody else that's in our space, in our library. They also impact how that person we're interacting with views us or can react to us. So we try to be really mindful of that and think through that when we're seeing behavior that we may not understand or may look like, it's different to us. We try to be mindful of these different lenses and contextual factors that impact behavior. This also means that we work really hard to make sure our libraries are welcoming to all of the people we serve, and that we look at words we're using, we look at the artwork on our wall, we look at what images we're using when we advertise programming on social media. We look at everything we're doing through this lens of trying to understand how it may impact or be interpreted by people from different demographic groups. We try to make sure we offer culturally relevant programming and services in our libraries. We work to create cultural and cross-cultural opportunities for interaction between people and connections between our patrons and our staff. We work to make sure our spaces are accessible by all, and that we assess intentionally the needs of marginalized communities that may be served by our library to again make sure that we are keeping their needs in mind and creating a welcoming, inclusive, and accessible space for them. So in a library, there are several things we do. Those are talking about principles in general. I'm going to talk first about how this looks if we are trying to implement a trauma-informed organizational approach. And then I'm going to talk specifically about trauma-informed programming. And then there will be a chance to ask questions here. So when we are trying to implement a trauma-informed organizational approach as an administrator or management library, the first thing we need to do is make sure that we are working intentionally to create a culture of care for everybody in our space. That we really are operating from this relationship first approach. That people know that they matter most, right? That the decisions we make and the choices that we make in our library every day are based on what we think people need around us and what information we're getting about what people need. We want to normalize talking about mental health. So in most of our environments, we talk openly if we're sick or if we've been sick. We talk about physical health, about thinking twice about it. We don't have that same kind of openness often with mental health because of the stigma around mental health. But it's really important to create a psychologically safe library space that we normalize talking about mental health and talking about how our mental health is impacted by the work that we're doing. We want to make sure that we debrief after significant events that are happening, and we normalize talking about stressful or difficult events. So when you think back to that institutional betrayal slide I talked about, one of the things that comes up over and over when we see firsthand accounts of people who are experiencing this institutional betrayal is they felt like they couldn't openly talk about what happened. Nobody cared, nobody wanted to listen, nobody asked if they were okay. So it's really important to give people an opportunity to process things and talk about it after something really stressful and traumatic has happened in the library. We focus on sustainable practice and self-care. So sustainable practice. So a lot of times the focus when we're talking about burnout, when we're talking about stress, the focus is on self-care. Like if you just do enough for yourself, you'll be fine, right? If you go home and take a bubble bath, if you go for a walk, if you do something you enjoy, then all of a sudden you'll be fine. Sustainable practice shifts the focus of caring for people to the organization because, as we talked earlier, burnout, vicarious trauma, firsthand trauma, yes, there are some individual factors that may impact people's likelihood to experience those things, but those are all impacted based on the organization and working in that structure and in that system. So sustainable practice is a term that really focuses on what the library can do to help implement self-care approaches throughout the library. So making time, and I know sometimes it's more challenging than others based on budgets and staff, but if you can make time for there to be some sort of staff support group that happens during paid time, because people aren't going to do it on their own time, we can't expect somebody to do it outside of work. Creating structure. Some libraries have added mindfulness. They've added, they have somebody from the community come in and facilitate yoga or mindfulness regularly with their staff. So rather than just thinking about who can come in and facilitate programming for patrons, think about who in the community may be able to come in and actually offer something on a regular basis for your staff. But libraries are doing all kinds of approaches to try to address sustainable practice. So it's the organization taking responsibility for implementing and integrating self-care into the day-to-day activities of that library to take care of the workforce. We can seek feedback from our teammates and our patrons about what our library needs to offer, what would be helpful, what kind of practices would help. So it's really going through the process of getting feedback from staff, getting feedback from patrons about what kinds of things would help in that library, and using the feedback that you get to shape your practices and your programming and your activities. We want to emphasize the importance of reflective practice and create time and a safe space for that in the library. So again, that was what I was talking about when I was saying that many libraries are adding not just a time for staff support group, but that the group is really focused on what can we learn from these things, that we've created such a safe, psychologically safe environment where people can freely say, I'm not sure I really handled that the best. I didn't feel prepared for what happened. Because that is normal. Like, I've been a social worker for many years, but there are so many things that happen every day that I'm like, I didn't know what to do with that. That was unexpected. So we want to create an environment in our library where people can say that, and then we can learn from that. Nobody has to fear being punished or having some sort of consequence from that. But instead, they have an opportunity to practice reflective practice and learn from it, and that we work together on strategies to try to make sure people are prepared for that kind of circumstance to happen again. We want to have plans for handling both psychological and physical emergencies and crises in our library. So some libraries have really good emergency response processes for physical emergencies that happen, for an active shooter, or bomb threat, for a fire. But we don't always have as well-developed policies and processes in place for somebody who has a mental health crisis in the library, or somebody who's distraught about something and they're crying and nobody's sure what to do. So it's really helpful to have well planned out and thought out responses and strategies in place for all kinds of emergencies. Mental health first aid is something that's really helpful. I don't know if any of you have ever participated in a mental health first aid training. Mental health first aid is a couple hands nodding. Mental health first aid, and it's used in lots of different settings that are all non-mental health settings. And it's used for just knowing how to recognize a mental health crisis when it happens, and that includes substance use related crisis, and being able to respond to get somebody the help they need. And mental health first aid has been shown to increase preparedness for handling these kinds of emergencies that happen in libraries of all kinds, but also has been shown to increase the confidence and decrease stress of the people working in libraries, because people feel more confident to respond when something comes up. So often you can find online, if you just look at the mental health first aid website, you can find trainings that may be in your area, people who often will do this for free or a low cost, because we're worth participating in and you have the opportunity. It's helpful for libraries to actually advocate for or create a trauma-informed work group of staff and usually patrons. I would suggest including patrons in that as well, who can really assess the organization as a whole, the organization's ability to respond to trauma-related needs that are coming up in staff and patrons, and can help guide and move forward strategies to improve the response over time. And then sometimes libraries do need to request consultation or support. There are a number of people who are doing consultation with libraries around trauma-informed practices, who can help if you need external support for what you're trying to do in your library. And then trauma-sensitive programming is really important so that everything you do in your library, again, you're being mindful of the impact of trauma and intentionally trying to avoid re-traumatizing somebody. So before any programming you do in your library, you think about the language you're using in how you talk about the program, how you are advertising that program, but you make sure that you're using language that's inclusive and welcoming to all who are served by your library, and that you're being intentional to make sure you're not doing anything that might be seen as being judgmental about some of these experiences. You want to notify your patrons up front that your library welcomes everybody and that you'll make reasonable accommodations as needed. You want to make sure it's very clear what somebody should do if they need accommodations so that they don't have to try to seek something out. They can ask for accommodations. We also want to try to make sure that as much programming as possible is just fully accessible and that people don't need to request an accommodation if possible. It's helpful to provide an outline or objectives up front so that people know what's going to happen, they know what to expect, they can make a choice about whether or not they want to participate or whether it's going to be harmful for them in some way. We want to provide clear information about programming choices they have. So if they choose not to participate in this one, we may have something else come in the future that will be on a related topic. We want to give warnings about anything that we're going to do in the library that may have quick movement, somebody may be touched, there may be a sound that's unexpected. We want, again, for people to know what to expect so they can choose whether or not to participate. And really, we want to make sure that this is with everybody. You want to give a warning ahead of time about anything that could be triggering to somebody that's experienced trauma. We want to make it clear where exits are, restrooms, things like that. Make it clear that people can leave as they need to so that nobody feels cornered or like they have to stay if they are experiencing some sort of emotional distress or getting upset or triggered about what's happening. We want to ask before touching anyone, and this pertains to everybody in our lives, not just our patrons, but also our colleagues. We want to ask before touching people. Some people are comfortable with being touched, some are not. But we want to make sure that people can be prepared for that and welcome that, or safely let you know that. It's helpful for all of our programming. If you have fidget toys available, people can doodle with paper and color pencils or whatever. And I don't know about you, but I often doodle or write. Like, it helps me pay attention more or focus. So being mindful of that no matter who we're serving, if there's a place to give them some tools so that they can self-soothe and that they can do what they need to do to focus and keep present and want to that. We want to have procedures in place, again, as part of our safety planning for responding to anybody who actually does become upset or distressed because of programming that we're doing. We want to make sure that we're asking for ideas from our patrons and that we're implementing those ideas into the programming that we're offering, and we're using their feedback on the quality of our programming to improve what we're doing in the future. We want to add programming about resilience, mindfulness, yoga, stress relief, Tai Chi, all kinds of things that we can think about integrating into our libraries that can be trauma-informed programming, and again, also for our staff, not just the patrons we serve. It's really helpful, if possible, to create a sensory-friendly space for people in our library. Some people need quiet and some people don't. And again, I understand that some libraries are set up for this a little better than others, depends on the size and the way your library is laid out. But some libraries are able to offer noise-canceling headphones for people if they can't have a quiet space, or to get funding to have earplugs and noise-canceling headphones for people that like quiet. If that's the route you go in your library, do keep in mind that sometimes wearing noise-canceling headphones can actually be traumatizing to somebody who needs to be aware of their surroundings. So you still could have people who like quiet that are not comfortable putting on the noise-canceling headphones because they need to hear what's happening. But if we can create a quiet sensory-friendly area, that's really helpful. We want to build our collection of relationships with community partners that are relevant to your patron population. So many times, and again, it varies based on your community, and it takes a lot of attention and work to build these collaborations and sustain them. Many times there are social service agencies, mental health agencies, substance use agencies, public health agencies, domestic violence programs, homelessness serving organizations, but there are partners in your community who can come in and offer programming that can be helpful to your patrons that you're serving, as well as to the staff that are part of the library. So you want to look for community partners and try to develop those when possible. There are a couple of resources that might be helpful. One is a trauma-informed framework for supporting patrons. This book was developed specifically for public libraries by the PLA Social Worker Task Force, but it's a workbook of best practices for trauma-informed approaches to patrons. There's also a trauma-informed approach to library services by Rebecca Tolley, and then the book that I have is coming out in September, Creating a Person-Centered Library, Best Practices for Serving High-Needs Patrons. So these resources might be helpful for any of you who are interested in this topic. So we have about 15 minutes, I think, if anybody has questions.
So if you have a question, I want to remind everybody we do have an online audience, so we ask if you have a question, you use the mic. Our great students will bring the mic so you can just raise your hand. And our students, and if you're online, you're also welcome to chat as a question, and our students will share that with the speaker.
While we're waiting to see about questions, I'm also going to put up this last slide has my email address and my website. If anybody isn't comfortable asking a question here, I am certainly fine if you want to send me an email after the fact to ask questions.
Hello. I'm very glad for this program. The one thing that I was curious about is when you had the peer support groups for staff that would participate, would there be a facilitator for that, and what was the level of buy-in?
Yes, so we have to remember that some people really like groups and some people hate groups. So I personally feel like it's really important to appreciate and respect people's preferences in that way. So I don't think a group should be mandatory. Some people just don't process things that way, and participating in a group is actually more stressful for them. So in groups, there have been both strategies. So some groups have had a facilitator. Sometimes I facilitate groups with staff, actually working on a statewide grant in another state right now to be able to pay for social work facilitators to facilitate groups with staff right now. In many cases, though, that's not, there's not necessarily so that it can facilitate. Although in some cases, I'm thinking through like people from a university who might be, sometimes there are faculty, like social work faculty or mental health counseling faculty who might be willing to do that on a time-limited basis as a volunteer. But in many cases, libraries are trying to do those support groups on their own. And that can be a little more challenging. So there have definitely been both approaches, but there is the buy-in piece is important. So again, if you make it optional so people don't have to do it, there almost always is a group of people who really want that kind of support and who will participate. But it's really important that participation is built into their schedule somehow, because again, can't expect people to do that on their own necessarily. So it has to be built into the schedule, which again, gets really challenging for many libraries, depending on how many staff are there and how much staff overlap. So some of what libraries are trying to do that can't do a group, there actually are some strategies they can do to have reflective practice pairs where just two people are paired up and they go to lunch together and they take their break at the same time to do some sort of activity. So it doesn't necessarily have to be done in a large group. There really are some strategies people can do in pairs, or even people who don't want to process with another person. Because again, some people are comfortable with that and some people aren't. There are strategies you can use where people might have an assignment that you ask them to write about in their, like on their own in a journal, that they kind of think through things, but they don't necessarily have to share it. So you could get more buy-in if you have different strategies that work for different people.
Hello. Yeah, I think just follow from the website. But I really made me think about what you were thinking about institutional betrayal, and at what level does that betrayal take place? For instance, you consider Greensboro Public Library, considering the betrayal happening at the library level, or you could say the Greensboro Public Library is a constituent element of the city of Greensboro, and therefore the betrayal is happening at the city level. And so again, my question is, how do we make this conversation not just a library conversation, but a community conversation? Because the solution ultimately is not going to come one library at a time, it's going to come at a community level. So how do we get to that level so we can actually get to the seasons that we need?
Yeah, I'll just say all of these things I talked about are really community challenges. So when we look at the growing problems that are happening in libraries, the growing numbers of people experiencing mental health problems, the growing numbers of people in poverty, like all of these are community level challenges. So we can't put all of the burden on libraries to come up with all the solutions to these things, right? So I think that's an important point, that the betrayal, the sense of institutional betrayal is often focused on the immediate institution. So it is often focused on the library itself, and library administration oftentimes. It's decreased if administration are made, if people in administration are making attempts to respond in some way to, you know, it's better to do something than nothing. Like sometimes people in libraries are uncomfortable because it's hard to work in a public library right now. It's hard to work in any library right now. It's really hard to be an administrator in a library because you've got these demands coming from all different areas. And so people at the administrative level are sometimes struggling with how to respond. And what I always tell them is it's better to do something than nothing. Don't let the fear of doing something wrong like paralyze you from just responding as a human and asking if a person's okay, because that can reduce that sense of institutional betrayal. But the sense of betrayal often, even though yes, it's a community issue and the solutions need to come from communities, the sense of betrayal is often aimed at the immediate supervisors, the immediate structure of the library.
Good morning. So yes, the whole time I was listening to this, well, first of all, wow. But every time you say library, I'm not from the public school environment, so anytime you say library, I heard schools. Anytime you say staff, I heard teachers, maybe. Anytime you say patrons, I heard students. How this could benefit the school environment these days. So my question is there any resources that, you know, like trauma-informed framework or approach that has been done in terms of public schools these days?
I don't know any resources off the top of my head that are targeted specifically for schools, but you were exactly right that everything that we're seeing in any type of library and all of the work that I've done primarily in public libraries applies very clearly to schools, because we are seeing the same shifts in the needs of students in schools and the stress and strain that that's causing for teachers and for everybody that's working in the school environment. So it's certainly very relevant in school libraries as well. And the same in academic university level libraries. The same, we're seeing these huge shifts in student demographics at universities that are impacting people in that environment as well. So I don't know, I'll be glad to look and see if I can find specific resources that would apply to school, the school community as a whole, and I can send something if I find it, or if you want to, I'll be happy if you want to give me your card or anything, and I'll look and see if I can find something specifically for that context.
Hi, I'm Terry. I work in the Jackson Library here. Very interesting. My question or comment revolves around employees within the library who experience trauma outside of the library. A lot of what we talk about is experiencing trauma within the library. And there's lots of different issues related to that. We can refer them to HR, which maybe employees feel HR is there for the institution and not for the employee. We can refer them to services outside, that they can go to. But how do we support, or how can we support within our employer environment, those who experience trauma outside of the library where it's not necessarily considered the work environment that they're experiencing? Do you address that in the book?
We do not specifically address that in the book. The book is really focused on, it is focused on organizational approaches for supporting staff who experience trauma in general, because the impact is the same, except for the institutional betrayal piece that happens at the library. The impact and the trauma response that somebody has is very similar, whether they experience that trauma outside the library or inside the library. It can just be magnified sometimes by the institutional piece. You're exactly right. Like, looking for whatever resources are in your community, it's very tricky, no matter what type of library you're in, because most of the time the resources that are available are not really adequate for. It's the same thing we were talking about in the community, right? We don't have enough resources in the whole state for people that have mental health problems and mental health challenges, and that impacts our staff as well as the patrons and people we're serving. So you can give them the resources like the EAP if there's one, or the HR support. You can let them know about mental health supports and organizations that are in your local community. But sometimes there are waiting lists, sometimes there are financial barriers, sometimes agencies have very short, they can only see somebody for a certain number of sessions. So I don't have any magic solutions for what you're talking about, except just connecting people with the resources that are there and showing them that you support them and that you care about them. Even your response, like your question today, your response, and trying to connect with them with something is, again, better than doing nothing. Like, you're showing that human-centered, person first, relationship first kind of approach with somebody to try to help, but understanding that there are barriers. Even if you give them resources, they may not be able to access these resources. So I wish I had a magic solution for that, but that's going back to Noah's point. That's a community-wide issue. One of the things that I think is really essential, many times in many communities, people underestimate the knowledge that the libraries have about the problems that are existing in that community and the gaps that exist in that community. And what I find is, no matter what library I'm talking to, they have their finger on the pulse of what's happening in that community, where there aren't enough services, where there are barriers, because that's impacting the people that you are working with in your library, whether it's staff or the people you're serving as patrons. And so libraries should always be at the table when there's a community task force about something, when there's an opportunity for, addressing whether it's mental health challenges in that community or housing instability or poverty. Libraries should be at the table. And, I think I hear sometimes that people don't understand how much you actually see in your library, but those are structural and systemic issues that need lots of people to solve around the adequate mental health services for people to deal with the trauma that's happening even outside the library.
So my daughter is an attorney and she specializes in domestic violence. So you can imagine secondary trauma is substantial. What they're able to do, though, that libraries aren't doing, I suspect, is that they provide during work hours counseling. It's paid for by the organization. Healthcare doesn't cover it. It's not mandated, but it's very highly encouraged. It's a shame that comes. It's a shame you don't. Do we have any online questions?
Hello again, more staff time. So let's say we have all the magic pieces in place. So like we have our peer support group set up. We have a staff that's willing to participate, but we have people who work in libraries for a while, know that there are always those who just won't, like, no matter what, like, they're not interested in providing empathetic care. They're not interested in the, like, taking care of themselves or others, really, they're just there to show up and clock their time clock. So, and I realize this, I just more into like deep mental health care, but also like HR stuff, but it's kind of like a vague, nebulous thing that's moving. Is like, how do you make the next step? Because ultimately, like, people have to change for themselves before they're willing to help anyone else. But like, how do you move the stick in the mud? Like, and I imagine, is like that there were probably individuals in your work with Indianapolis, this probably came up. So like, what was like peer pressure, like.
So, and at this point, I started working with Indianapolis. I worked now with public libraries across the US. And again, some state library associations were doing statewide strategies and interventions. So, and what you're describing comes up in all of those settings where, yes, there are some people that are on board with this, that are really excited about this. There are always some people that just are not interested. And I think it's really important in every library system that there's a clear message that comes from the top down. There has to be really strong leadership around this and setting the expectations for what that library is going to be undertaking, what is going to be the expectations of all staff who work in the library, why it's important, and then yes, like there's peer pressure moving forward. We often see changes that happen in policies that impact some of the stragglers who may not have been eager to participate in the first place. But when the whole library starts moving in a direction, then people sort of have to get on board, or sometimes they make a choice that that's not the environment for them, and they may leave. But when there's a clear message that comes from the top explaining why it's important, why we're doing this, and that there are some different strategies in place for different people. So again, respecting that people have different preferences, and some people want a group, some people don't. So again, having a strategy where if you don't want to participate in a group, you don't have to, but you're going to be asked to do this and report back to your supervisor about like a one-on-one conversation about what you did with that. And that it's just set as expectations, and then everybody starts moving in that direction, and then there's conversation about it in staff meetings. It just becomes the culture of organization, and that's challenging, and that's a long process. I mean, that's what like people have to realize. You can't just snap your fingers and everybody's going to be on board with that. It's a long journey to move in this direction. It takes a lot of intention on behalf of leadership and the leadership team to keep things moving. And it is going to be difficult for a while, and there are going to be people that sort of fight against it for a while, but they eventually come along, or they sometimes choose to go somewhere else if that culture is not for them.
Did everyone have a chance to ask their questions? One last one. Okay, good. Well, Dr. Wahler is staying for lunch, I think, with us, so feel free to chat with her. And thank you so much. She is ready. You'll exit these doors here to the buffet. I'm not going to try to coordinate anything. And we will return at just a little bit after 12. And I'll tell you things I think might be interested to know about our program. We'll make the BPOX alumni award, and then we'll begin our panel at 12:30. So please enjoy lunch. Let us know if you need anything besides clothes, gloves, and hats. I have a big note to myself to introduce myself, which I haven't done yet. So, I am Lisa O'Connor. I am the chair of the Department of Library and Information Science. And I'm really happy you're here. I thought that was just wonderful. I really enjoyed the presentation this morning. And we've got a great panel this afternoon. I just want to make you aware. Can you hear me all right? I feel like I want to mess with this.
I want to make you aware of a couple of things that are going on in our program. And the first thing I want to do is actually to make you aware of some challenges we face. And I'm a little nervous about doing this because I've got to be somewhat delicate. It's our troubles are they're coming from outside of our organization. But I think it's really important for our community to know what's going on. So as you know, public universities are funded through an appropriation from the state. And as you know, we're in a big system and we are governed by the Board of Governors of the UNC system. And I will say that there is, as far as I know, there's not financial exigency at that level. However, okay, I'm not going to editorialize. So there is a new funding model that will go into effect next fiscal year. And it's very complicated. I won't go into it, but in essence, that funding model has ended up, whether intended or not, highly disadvantaging institutions like ours that are, we serve a high number of underrepresented students. We serve a high number of first generation college students. And the metrics that are applied in this funding formula work very much against us. And they also work very much against graduate programs. PhD programs will be funded at about a quarter of what they were, and master's degree programs at about half of them. And I think it's important for you all to be aware of this because in the end, what it will mean is that if you want a graduate degree, you'll have to go to a really expensive institution that can afford to still offer them. It's not a good trajectory that we're on, and it has caused, while UNCG was in very good financial shape a couple of years ago, it's caused us to flip on a dime, and now we have some very severe financial challenges. I think I've heard that next year will be 10 million off because of the foreign farm. Does that sound right to you? About 10 million in the red. There's a second issue too, which is there's what they're calling a demographic flip, where there just aren't as many incoming college students. And when you shift the funding model to favor undergraduate students who are highly funded, and at the same time, you're having a decline in undergraduate enrollment, it's sort of a perfect storm. So if you care about UNCG, if you care about higher ed in North Carolina, especially as it occurs in the non-flagship institutions like State and Chapel Hill, they'll just be fine, right, no matter what. But institutions like ours can play a really important role. We are #1 in North Carolina for upward social mobility. So we have a very important role in the state. And if you're interested, there was an editorial recently, I can't remember what it was, but if you're interested, I can share with you. But if you think about it, write your congressperson, get involved if you can. It's sort of seems to be a secret at this point. People aren't aware of it, that it's going on. So anyway, that's my very brief political editorial. But the good news for us is that we are in great shape in our department. We are doing great. We had 3 new faculty that we began this year. As Randy told you, we've really grown. In 6 or 7 years, we've gone from a total of 250 students to almost over 500 now, from 8 faculty to 16. So it's nice for the resource to follow that growth. And we have not one program. We used to just be an MLIS with some licensure programs, but now we have 3 programs. So I want to tell you just a little bit about those. And if you have any interest in them, if you know people who might be interested in them, we'd love it if you share the information with them. So the first is an undergraduate program in information science. And there is a brochure back there.
It's a great preparatory program if, somebody wants to be a librarian ultimately, or wants to go in some other aspect of information science, knowledge management, web development, those kinds of things. One of our faculty members in that program is at Loftus. Dr. Loftus is here, and he would love to answer any questions you have about the program, and as can I. But pick up a brochure if you know somebody you want to try to convince to get an undergraduate degree. Good. The other program that we have that is new is Masters of Science in Instructional Technology and Design. We've hired 2 new faculty we're really proud of and excited about. It is a great 33-hour degree in planning and designing instruction. Dr. Katie Walters is here, and she would love to talk with you about it, and we have brochures for that as well. If you're not ready for a full master's, we have a 4-course certificate, a 12-hour certificate in instruction design, which is truly useful for any librarian who's out there teaching and designing instructions. Katie made a little small flyer for you on that, so if you're interested, grab one, or if you know someone who is, talk with Katie afterwards. I know she'd be glad to talk with you. So that's all really exciting, and what it's done for us, it's not just grow our enrollment, but it's actually allowed us to expand the expertise that we can offer students, even in the MLIS. So, for example, Nadir is the other faculty member in instructional technology and design. He may be online or may not, but he's also wonderful. He's designed a gamification class, which is really an exciting addition to and it's open to all of our students. So, and the BSIS has allowed us to expand into some areas like intelligence, cybersecurity, so it's really nice. And we're very proud. If you have any questions about that or want to help us, just let me know. I'll be more than glad to put you to work. I also would let you know as stakeholders in our program that we are near the end of our accreditation. We will have a site visit in spring of 26 for reaffirmation of our accreditation. So in the next year and a half, you will begin to see us ramp up. So if you're an alum, we may be contacting you, asking you for your feedback, and we hope that you will really help us out. ALA accreditation is extremely important to have for this MLIS degree. And so we will be asking you to be involved with us and to help us. I also want to introduce you to Caitlin. Caitlin is our new outreach coordinator, and I'm not sure which last name. Hawkins, thank you. Caitlin Hawkins is our new outreach coordinator. She does a lot of our helping us with student recruiting, helping us with social media. So I'm sure on her behalf, she would like for me to say like us on Facebook. Follow us on Instagram, on LinkedIn, Twitter, all of those. We'd love to have you. It's a way that we get information out. Even more importantly, if you are an alum or in other ways associated with our program, we'd like to have news from you. It's so exciting to get news about you've got a new job, you won this award, and we just absolutely love passing that on to our social media folks. So please do let us know, and if you can find Caitlin's email online, or you can email me or any of the other faculty that you know, we'll make sure that she gets that to disseminate. So we really appreciate you staying involved and keeping us crazy what's going on with you if you're alum. Finally, just a little pitch for giving. As you may understand, state funds from our appropriations can only be used for certain things. There are a lot of restrictions on what we can use them to pay for. So giving becomes important because that allows us to have funds that we can use to, say, send a student to a conference to present a paper. Most of the donations that we make end up being student-oriented kinds of support that we just can't do with state funds. So there's a tent on your table. With a QR code. No gift is too small. That's really true. Having broad support from a large number of people really is just great for our program. So $5, whatever it is, if you feel like you can give, we really appreciate that. And it will almost certainly go to support students and student activities that we cannot fund through state allocations. I think that's all I have. So I'm going to introduce Professor Tammy Brewer, and I want to thank her that she has really done so much to make this. Go back somewhere.
Want to help me again with the Wahlers? You did that last year.
Putting Lisa to work, which is something I don't get to do much. And I have a little history to read, so I have put mine at 19.5, Lisa, so that hopefully I can read it without too many buzzes. The UNCG LIS Alumni Association sponsors the B. Kovacs Alumni Award to recognize exceptional service and achievement by graduates of the UNCG LIS department. Dr. B. Kovacs, who unfortunately cannot be here with us today, devoted more than 20 years of distinguished service to the training and education of librarians and information professionals. Her teaching and research have often exemplified the highest standards of scholarship, and she has been a trusted member, advisor, and loyal friend to her students and colleagues, as many of your faculty are today to you as well. I know we have a few students here. Therefore, the UNCG LIS Alumni Association recognizes and honors Dr. Kodak's exceptional contribution to the students of the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and the profession of library and information science by presenting the B. Kovacs Alumni Award to the UNCG LIS alumni each year. Nominations are made through the recommendation of faculty and alumni on a nomination form shared yearly in the LIS alumni newsletter. You got it. Everybody get that? See that? Oh, okay, good. And on our new alumni website. If you would like more information on how to nominate a colleague, please follow us on your favorite social media. Okay. This year's recipient was chosen out of a group of 7 amazing UNCG alumni nominees. Very hard to choose. I had quite a few people give their opinions. This person doesn't know that they're receiving this award today, so it would be a surprise. And her recommendation reads from the person who recommended her to say this. This 2009 UNCG LIS graduate would be an excellent choice for this award and is an outstanding example of the qualities of leadership and librarianship that the UNCG LIS program wants its alumni to exemplify. This person is currently serving as the Director of Media Services for Winston-Salem County Schools. Surprise. She's been in this role for several years, helping to shepherd the system through the seismic shifts that occurred during the COVID pandemic. She has been an invaluable resource and support for the school library media coordinators in her district in dealing with challenges to materials, ebooks, print books, classroom materials. We could keep listing what's mentioned. Perhaps most importantly, she has served as the voice and advocate for the school libraries at the central office in Winston-Salem Versailles, keeping them central in the conversation on literacy, on diversity, and on access. This alumni also served as the chair of the High School Battle of the Books for the North Carolina Library Media Association and is a strong advocate for inquiry-based learning and school librarianship. So if you are in Winston-Salem Versailles County Schools, have you heard Karen say inquiry-based learning? I have heard that. She routinely facilitates and teaches professional development of the district and is in direct communication with principals and district leaders to advocate for a quality school library program in each school and across the state. She is one of our panelists for today.
and for this afternoon's discussion, and she has worked with Dr. Dawkins on her research. Most recently, it should be noted that she values higher education and is an applicant in the doctoral program here at UCG. Didn't know I knew that. Did you? And she's got examples, so I got her. It's purely an excellent choice for this award. It is an outstanding example of the qualities of leadership and librarianship that UCG this program wants its alumni to exemplify. Would you agree? This year's recipient is 2009 LAS alumni, Karen Meier. And current students studying the program. She has collaborated on research with faculty, supported internships and placements of pre-service school librarians. And if that isn't enough, it isn't enough to support over 70 librarians in the center. I got the number right. Karen has also found time to be an adjunct professor in the professional development district. She is truly amazing and exemplifies the standards and values of the VCOVAC. Welcome.
I surprised her.
Sorry. Okay, thank you.
I'm just gonna say thank you. I'm absolutely blown away. We were here. That was awesome. Thank you. I love the program here at NCG. It's great. And I tell all my folks, this is where you need to be.
If you're interested in the history of our program or learning about the VCOVAC award winners, if you'll email the lis.uncg.edu, we'll be glad to link you to our website and to give you more information. We'd also love for you to nominate. So if you have someone you'd like to nominate for the program, we'd like to read your nomination for next year. Thank you. Thank you so much. Congratulations. And I forgot to mention something. I hate to go from really happy to bummer again. About challenges. I also want to make you aware that in multiple states, if you haven't been reading about it, legislators in Florida, South Carolina, others, Tennessee, legislation has been passed that enables or compels universities to inventory people who are involved in any kind of work associated with equity, diversity, and inclusion. No purpose is really quite stated for that yet, except to sort of understand how much universities spend on each guy. Recently in North Carolina, was passed a compelled speech policy, which basically states that we cannot make contingent for hiring, promotion, or a bunch of other things. We cannot compel any kind of affirmative statement of belief. And so traditionally here in the School of Ed, we've asked for statements on equity, diversity, and inclusion from our potential new faculty, because we want to understand their commitment to those things. And we will be prohibited from soliciting those kinds of statements probably. So academic freedom isn't just being abridged at the K-12 level. We are also experiencing it. I think it's really time to be aware of that and to wage a good war of it. And if you don't see me tomorrow, the Board of Governors came and got me. Yes, I maybe everybody. Really, it's that kind of environment where people are afraid. And I think it's important not to let that fear keep us from doing what we need to do. So on that,
You know, you say that prophets never known in their own country, and some of us who really know and love Dr. Dawkins may not realize what a big deal she is and how much visibility she brings us to this program. I'm not gonna do that. Why am I doing that? I don't know. Because I'm just so proud of all of these folks. But she is a big deal. She is a leading expert on intellectual freedom and rights for in this country, and she's doing all kinds of great work. And welcome her, and she's going to introduce our panelists.
Sitting too far back. There you go. So that's for you. How I rated this nice seat. So. I think I'm going to end up holding this, otherwise it's not going to work well.
Are there microphones on? Yeah, they are. Okay, so we invited our folks here to talk about sort of the elephant in the room among libraries these days, which is challenges to materials and sort of the eroding trust in libraries that seems to be happening. So I reached out to Wayne County and said I didn't know who to talk to, and I was in touch with Dan and Kate, and then Karen, you know now. And this is Valerie Byrd Fort from South Carolina. I'm gonna let them do a little brief introduction of themselves, and then we'll get started. And we're gonna probably talk for about 40 minutes. We've got 6 or 7 questions. Feel free, if you've got a question, you can ask it in the middle. You don't have to wait till the end. And we'll also try to give about 15 minutes at the end for additional. Hey, Kate, would you get us started?
Hi, can you all hear me? My name is Kate Taylor. I'm the manager of the Leesville Community Library, part of Wayne County Public Libraries. We're a large system in Wayne County of 24 libraries now, 23 libraries. Leesville Community Library is in northwestern Raleigh, kind of on the Durham County border. And it serves a suburban community. But I'm here in my role as the chair of the Collection Development Policy Committee.
I'm Dan Brooks. I am the selection manager in collection development for Wayne County Public Libraries. I've been in that role for almost 5 years. And I've been working to connect books and readers for 29 years, 10 years in retail bookstore management, and then 19 years now with Wayne County Public Libraries. And I worked with Kate on the collection development policy, and just before that policy was developed, we sort of did it in reverse order. I led the committee to develop our request for reconsideration policy. Normally the collection development policy would come first, but due to circumstances going on, we had to come up with a new request for reconsideration policy right away.
Okay, I'm Karen Meier. You have my whole history already. I'm not going to say a lot more on internet.
I'm Valerie Byrd Fort. First, I'd like to just take a moment to recognize Visibility Day. And also I am an instructor at the University of South Carolina, and I teach children's materials and children's literature to pre-service teachers. I am also the coordinator for Cocky's Reading Express. And I don't know how many of you are going to know who Cocky is, since it is in South Carolina. So we kicked off almost this evening, Friday, I will get into the point in just a moment. So Cocky's Reading Express is the university's literacy outreach initiative, and we travel all over the state reading to kids and giving books away. And we have been doing that for 15 years. Also, I was an elementary school librarian before becoming faculty for the high school. Oh, you don't need that. So first, I want to say thank you all for being here today. I really appreciate your time and your expertise. And this is going to be not, you don't have to answer every question. You can answer the ones that you want to add to. But I do have one that's specifically from Wayne County. So Wayne County has dealt with some challenges, and over the past few years, some garnering a fair amount of media attention. So can you tell us more about that situation and what happened as a result of it?
Sure. Just to point out a little, perhaps typo, I'm not the founder of Wake County Library, I'm the CEO, which is my title there. Well, without airing too much dirty laundry, there was our former process for handling requests for reconsideration was that they went directly to the senior library manager of collection development. She would consult with the selection librarians and myself to gather information about the book and the authors as requested or needed, and then she would make a decision and respond to the patron. And in December of 2021, the decision was made to remove the book Genderqueer because of graphic depictions of nudity and sexual acts, not because of the LGBTQ plus content. But that's obviously how it was interpreted, and there was a lot of media attention, a lot of outcry from staff. Folks were very upset, and then beginning of January, I was called into a meeting and said, okay, now we need to come up with a new request for reconsideration policy that will not have one person in charge of this process. Here you go, make that happen. So I worked with the director of community services for Wake County, as well as one of our senior library managers and a committee of about 15 people and librarians from all over the county. We even had a library assistant as well. It was a process where we looked at ALA guidelines. We looked at many other policies of other library systems around the country. And we just worked through it over a period of, I think, 2 months in total. We had a deadline to have it ready for the Wake County Commissioners meeting for them to approve it and sign off. I mean, they didn't have to officially approve it because it's a library policy, not determined by them, but to present it to them for. Yeah. So that's what happened, and now we have a new policy. And then the way the new policy works is that when we receive a challenge, we have a committee of 9 professional librarians who review and discuss and make a decision together. And the committee is composed of myself. I get to be on every single challenge until the day I retire. The appropriate material selection librarian, if it's a children's book, adult fiction, adult nonfiction, et cetera. And then we have the rest of the committee, the other 7 members. We have 2 folks who are serving a 2-year term, 1 adult and 1 youth librarian, and then 2 other folks serving a staggered 2-year term on off years. So we always have new folks rotating in. So we've just done that. It's been exactly 1 year since we started this. And then for each request that comes up, I have a list of librarians who volunteered for the service, and I just choose 3 names at random, and then that's the rest of our committee. So, and we just completed our 9th book challenge in the past year, although the first 4 of them were reevaluating ones that had been done under the previous policy.
Thank you. So can you talk a little bit about the process of updating the policies? You can talk about reconsideration on this election, and Karen, you can talk about policy changes that might be in the works in Winston-Salem as well. And what are some do's and don'ts you might share with folks about that process?
So, as Dan said, we worked in reverse. We started out by creating a new request for reconsideration policy. And at the time that genderqueer was removed from the collection, we did not have a formal collection development policy that was available online or even internally for patrons and staff to refer to, or for Dan's CDS Collection Development Services team to use when selecting and evaluating books, which is frankly a little shocking for a library system the size of Wake County. I have been, involved in some of the advocacy efforts for reevaluating genderqueer, and the community services director appointed me to the collection development policy committee. And, I assembled a team in much the way that Dan did, taking into account diversity and, diversity of roles and, all sorts of diversity in assembling the committee. And we looked at ALA best practices, of course, but we also looked at collection development policies from various libraries around the country. We drew heavily on Nashville Public Library, Denver, several others around the country in order to inform our practices. And it definitely took a little bit of trial and error. So if you are ever in the position of needing to create a collection development policy from the ground up, we had to pivot our strategy a few times, depending on what library staff felt was important, depending on, we had conversations about specific words. I would definitely advise anyone who's in a position of needing to create a collection development policy to lean heavily on the American Library Association and to not be afraid to have long drawn out conversations about even the smallest things, because the use of a particular word can really change the meaning of something in that policy. So those would be my two top tips to anyone in that position.
So in the school system, it's a little bit different. Because we're not only considering library materials, we have to consider instructional materials that are used in the classroom. So our board policy, in Winston-Salem Forsyth, our board policy is, we have an okay board policy for reconsideration. It's not strong. We are working on strengthening that. So our board policy, there's two parts to board policy. You have the board policy, and then you have what's called the AR, or the administrative regulation, which is like the superintendent's interpretation of how we're going to act out that board policy. So for reconsideration, those challenged materials, our board policy says the superintendent will create a plan. Basically, that's the summary. It's like 2 sentences long. And then of course we have to come up with how that's going to be, how is a challenge going to be handled. Right now our policy starts at the school level with a book, and that can be a book in the library, it could be a book that's being used in instruction, and we've had both. We've been fortunate to avoid any kind of formal challenges. Like that's our goal, is we want to avoid a formal challenge because that brings a lot of attention to the school system that is not always positive. We don't need any more negative in our school system, or neither does any school system, but it starts at the school. So our board policy, our AR starts at the school level. And then after that, if the person is not happy, whether it's the parent or whether it's a school employee, the librarian that might not be happy with the decision of their media technology advisory committee, which is the committee that oversees that. And they can take it, then what I would like to see is that it would then go to a district committee, but now it goes straight to the board. And we are fortunate that we don't have anybody on the board that is actively trying to ban books. Like several school systems across the state do have board members that ran on platforms of we're going to ban books. So we're working to kind of fix that policy. Our policy also doesn't really address, like district level, like we have a district ebook collection. What do we do if one of those books get challenged? How is that? Does it start at a school visit? So we're working towards making that clearer so that we know what to do when or if that happens. Because we've had some scares where some books were, we had somebody in the Republican Party, not trying to call out anybody's politics, but in the Republican Party that called out a list of books that were available and don't go to your school system, don't go to your school, go to the police kind of situation. But no, nothing ever materialized, but it was books found in our ebook collection that is a district level collection. So just trying to make sure that our policies support all the different types, all the different ways that kids are accessing materials that are supported in instruction, that are also supported through our libraries.
I do have kind of several thoughts with policies and procedures. So every state is different, right? And I'm in South Carolina. And a couple of years ago, our Governor McMaster, it's interesting, it also kind of started with genderqueer. He saw, images taken out of context and wanted a investigation of school libraries throughout South Carolina. How are these books being selected? How are they getting on the shelves? There needs to be policies in place. And so what we have tried to show to the citizens of South Carolina that there are certainly policies already in place, right? And so one thing that where I work, and I didn't mention this, my office is located at the South Carolina Center for Community Literacy. So that is, I was speaking with my table mate here, the Teacher Resource Center. We do a number of things, but one thing we did in response to Governor McMaster was created a resource for professionals, and we have a lot of information about policy development, updating of policies and such. And so that was kind of our response to that. And so it's a South Carolina Center for Community Literacy resource. It's open to everyone. But I also do a lot of work with the South Carolina Association of School Librarians. And so that is one aspect, I think, for school librarians in particular, public librarians too, because your state association will be very helpful to you in these policies. And every library is different. Every library is going to have a different policy in place, but the South Carolina Association of School Librarians worked very hard with our South Carolina Department of Education representative to create a model policy. And it went back and forth, and it's not perfect. There are things that we would still like to change as library professionals. For example, one thing that's still on that model policy is that when a book is going through a formal challenge, it's on the shelves. We want it to remain available, for checkout, all that's happening. But it is a model policy that school librarians can look at. And also, I'm sure that the library students in the room, you've got classes where you create policies. And one other thing to say with resources and then just policies in general, like making sure your staff and your teachers know about them, but then also making sure the community knows about them. And then all the time and thought and research that has gone into creating them. And with that said, there's also another resource that I forgot to mention that I really need to. I'm the project manager, and April is also part of the team for the Get Ready, Stay Ready toolkit, and that also has some great information about getting your community knowledgeable about what you do, and I think making sure they are aware of these policies is part of that.
April?
An online request, if each person could restate their name before they answer the question, so it's easier for them to keep track of who's speaking. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just piggyback on that. So what can we do to engage the community to speak up on behalf of libraries and library staff when we're dealing with these types of challenges? What engagement tactics could we use?
So we have a little experience with this in Wake County, having been in, the news for this type of thing. I'm Kate Taylor, sorry, Wake County Public Libraries. as someone, one thing that I would just say in general, especially to the students in this room who may be thinking of going into public librarianship, in North Carolina, at least, if you are a county or state employee, your emails are a matter of public record. And so your emails can be requested as part of the Freedom of Information Act requests. And so that is how my name ended up in the newspaper in association with a book challenge in Wake County. It didn't feel great, but when I was writing the email that ended up in the paper, I wrote it with an eye toward the fact that it may end up as part of a Freedom of Information Act request. So that's one thing that I think I just feel like I need to highlight. Because it does tie into public advocacy, because you know, if the public is and members of your community are reading about what you're saying in your local news, it's important that you represent yourself accurately and also professionally.
And that holds true for public school employees too. All of those email records are subject to FOIA requests.
And also, again, this is Kate Taylor. We did have a situation where a staff member's email was FOIA'd, and journalist writing the article made it sound as though she had interviewed the staff member, and the staff member got in touch with the journalist and requested that that be changed. So if you do find yourself in that position where a journalist is making it sound as though you spoke directly to them and they in fact got it through a FOIA request, you can ask them to change that.
This is Valerie. One thing, going back to policy, because I've taken notes, one thing that I wanted to mention, and just going back to our keynote from this morning, you mentioned that when there's policy in place, you can act swiftly and consistently. And so I think that's also important to consider with our library policies too, right? But in terms of getting the community engaged, I think it's really important to go to board meetings or to encourage your community to go to board meetings. If you don't feel comfortable going because of whatever reason, you know, there is the real issue of people losing their jobs, of you know, other kinds of effects happening when they speak out. So just encouraging others to speak out, or feel comfortable doing so, going to these school board meetings. In South Carolina, we are unfortunate enough to have folks that are really, these board meetings are very they're not fun to attend or to watch, but it's important to be there to show support. And to just make sure the community is aware as to what's going on. And I think as much as you can do also to just kind of let people know what libraries do in general, not always focusing it about censorship and book banning and intellectual freedom and what's going on right now, but just making sure the community is knowledgeable about what libraries are. A lot of times we're missing that, and I think building that relationship piece is really important.
I was going to add about the school board meetings. Amen to that, because that is really important. And even if you don't have students in the school system, to be aware of what's going on, because that impacts everybody. Because what goes on in the school library, I mean, there's a ripple effect, and it affects our children, their access to information, and it's just ultimately not fair when their access is limited to that. So I just wanted to add to that the importance of those attending that, if you have kids or if you don't.
And I just wanted to add this, Dan, I just wanted to add that I was able to attend ALA last year in Washington, DC, and one of the sessions I attended about intellectual freedom, one of the speakers, and I apologize to forget who it was, but they said it's important to be active in encouraging community members who are supportive of libraries to run for those roles on boards, whether it's a library commission, whether it's a board of trustees, whether it's a county position, whatever the sort of funding authorities, et cetera, are in your particular area and community. And for, you know, staff to do that as well, when it's appropriate and that sort of thing. So just want to encourage that.
This is Valerie, to kind of piggyback on that and going to these meetings, you know, going back to, you may not feel comfortable going to a school board meeting and speaking out in the school district or in the public library that you work in. but maybe a neighboring library in your school is having a similar issue, then you can go speak there because then you don't have that, right? That's just something to kind of think about too.
So this is April, I'll add something to this as well. I think it's really important that we build these relationships before a crisis occurs. We've got to have, be visible, be part of the community, be present at board meetings before you need to speak up in opposition to something that might be doing. Be there at the county commissioners meeting when they're talking about budgets. And engaging with the community and with stakeholder groups who also have some skin in the game. So we know the groups that are being targeted by challenged books. So working with those community organizations and encouraging them to be involved and making sure they are aware of what's being challenged. And so that they can speak up for the library and also of their community.
I want to add to, this is Karen, wanted to add to like your parents, like if you're a school librarian, like your parents need to be aware of what's going on. There are just a small number of very vocal parents that are trying to remove access to books. And there are so many more that want their kids to have access. And oftentimes where these are happening are at schools where you may have groups of parents that aren't going to be able to have the ability to go to a board meeting, or they may not because they're working. So we have to just make sure that your parents are aware of what's going on. They're aware of those selection policies. They're aware of anything like this that may go on. If you have a book challenge, let your community know, let your school community know, those parents and caregivers.
Okay, another question. How do you prepare your frontline staff in your public library, your school libraries, in the community to deal with patrons who either walk in or call with concern about material on the collection?
This is Karen, I'll start with it. So we have just we have 72 school libraries. We currently have 70 libraries, but 2 schools without. Anyhow, so preparing those staff, like it's really challenging because they're not only dealing with parents who may not want the book, but they may be dealing with administration that just want the book to go away because they don't want to deal with the publicity. And we had in a situation in the last week or 2 where a parent was very upset about a book and just wanted it pulled. The media coordinator, brand new media coordinator, immediately reached out to me, and I was there that afternoon. So for me, so Winston-Salem, we're fortunate that we have a director, not just me, but we have this position. Not all school districts have that. So sometimes media coordinators are flying solo in their district. And if they get a challenge, it becomes very scary because they're the only ones in their school that may be saying, hey, no, we shouldn't pull this book. But I let my folks know that they are not alone and they are very well, and we talk about what is the policy, what do you need to do? And my first response is that if you have a parent, I need you to contact me right away because I have your back. And I think that's really important to know that somebody at the district has their back on this, that they are not alone on it.
When we designed our policy for request for reconsideration, it was very purposeful in making sure that the policy was only available by coming into a library. Now, of course, if somebody said that they are immobile and can't get there, they call the library or whatever and spoke with the manager. But one of the things we included in our policy is that a request for reconsideration begins with a local conversation with the librarian or library manager. So we have a folder packet of information. It contains our full collection development policy, our request for reconsideration policy, the ALA, Reader's Bill of Rights, as well as the form. And that's the only way you can get the form. We made sure we did not want to put the form online and have keyboard warriors from who knows where So to submit a request for reconsideration in Wake County, you have to either be a resident of Wake County or an out-of-county paying card holder. And then we made sure to communicate that to staff as well, that this process begins with that conversation. So if someone comes in, you should have a few of these packets ready. You should walk them through what's included in the packet and point out, here's this part that it says in the policy, here's the ALA guidelines, here's this, before they take it home and then fill out the form and bring it back to submit. So that's one thing we've done to try to educate our staff and really make sure that begins that way before it gets to the next level. Just to add on another piece that we made sure to include, there was a lot of debate as we were developing the policy about, well, then is there an opportunity for someone to appeal the decision? And we decided no, because having a request for reconsideration is the appeal. First decision was we put the book in the library. This is the appeal of that decision, so that the committee's decision, which again, 9 professional librarians with rotating members, is final. The director cannot override it. The county manager cannot override it. The Wake County Board of Commissioners cannot override it. That is the final decision.
So you chose not to have any community members on that committee, because we end up with lots of community members on our reconsideration committees.
Sorry, Dan again. Yeah, that was something we discussed and considered for a while, but ultimately decided it's a professional librarian's job to make those determinations, and that's why we went with a good sized committee of 9, and it's an odd number in case we ever have to vote. There's definitely a majority. So yeah, it's something we discussed, but ultimately decided not to have any public community members on that.
This is Valerie, just to kind of piggyback on that, and I'm glad that you asked that, because I had a question about that too, that there were no community members on it, because just traditionally, for those of you that don't know, like in school libraries, when a challenge is done, a committee is then put together in some cases, like it's not even a committee that's already in place, it's at that point put together, and it'll have, a teacher, an administrator, a school librarian, it has like a montage, including community members. That's just a really, interesting committee makeup. And I know some people or some districts in our state, and it could be here too, have a community application process, sort of like where if you are interested in being on this reconsideration committee, fill out an application. I know one school district in South Carolina, at least, that does that. So that was just interesting, just to information, I guess, for how committees are put together. And maybe fun to say.
No, I just wanted to, it's Kate, sorry. I wanted to just highlight as a branch manager how successful the practice of having patrons come into the library and request a packet has been. I had an experience where a patron wanted to challenge a picture book, and the staff member did the right thing and got the packet and got me. Now, they wouldn't have to get me if the staff member had been comfortable having that conversation with the patron, they would have been welcome to. But in this case, they got me, and I showed the patron everything that was in there. I said, I went through it with them, and they ultimately decided not to submit a request for reconsideration once they had read our policy and understood what goes into purchasing books in the county. So I think that's been very successful for us.
This is Valerie, and I think a lot of times that is the case. They just want to be heard at first before, it may not be that they actually want that book removed from the shelf for everyone. It could be that they just really need to be heard and listened to. But in terms of getting your frontline staff ready, I think that advocacy plays a big role in that, because as libraries and librarians, the front line is really everyone, right? It's not necessarily just the folks that work in the library, but I think that having these conversations about, what to do when this happens is really an important part of your onboarding process. So everyone who is hired and comes on, making sure it's part of that training. If you're a school librarian, making sure that you do a little blurb at the faculty meetings at some point, at the beginning of the year, and then maybe repeating that throughout the year, because it's not just libraries, especially in K-12, that are getting these challenges and having to have these conversations, as the classroom teachers do, and it's not something that's really covered in teacher education programs. So I think that just, again, that communication piece and those building relationships and just, being transparent, like you mentioned earlier, I think is really important. There's no reason, none of this is secretive. Just getting the word out and letting everyone know what our policies are and how they're developed and making, getting everyone ready.
I'll mention that in North Carolina, K-12 schools, it depends on the school district how those committees are formed. Sometimes there are standing committees called the Media and Technology Advisory Committee. Sometimes they are constituted based on the challenge. One of the problems that we're having in North Carolina are groups, not parents, who are bringing forth lists of 20 or 30 books. So expecting a standing committee to review 20 books is pretty challenging. So they're coming up with ways to rethink the way those committees work. And I just want to, since I mentioned that, so how do we deal with these who are not really parents, who are there to save the children and then bring in a list of books you may or may not even in your collection? They bring in a list of books that they got off the internet somewhere and they want to know what you're doing. How do we handle that?
So we've had some questions like that. Looking for Alaska was one that was on a list that it went straight to the board. The board then sent it to our superintendent, and the superintendent sent it to me. And so we responded to the superintendent, and the superintendent responded. She's very supportive. We were very fortunate, but nothing ever came of that. For us, as far as we use our MTech committees. But when we think about these communities, I see, especially from smaller districts that may not have the district level support for libraries, they're struggling with this list of 40 books. And how do you deal with when because it takes time. It's a 4 to 6 week process minimum for people to have time to read the book, to convene a committee and then make a decision. So for us, as we're rewriting our board policy, we're thinking about things like that. And wanting to include where it has to be somebody, it has to be a parent at the school, that it can't be an outside parent, and including those types of things that are not currently in our policy, which makes our policy weaker than I want it to be, to avoid the list of 40 from somebody who's not even at the school.
They're not even in the study.
This is Dan, and I can say that our policy also includes the fact that once a book has been reconsidered and a decision was made, that book can then not be re-challenged for a period of 5 years. And while we had just concluded reevaluating genderqueer and reinstating the book, what was interesting was because the book had been removed and there was media attention, we had to purchase copies directly from Amazon, who we don't usually buy books from, we use Ingram, just so the committee would have copies to read. And then the number, because it was in the media, the number of holds on the book was well over 100. So that by the time we reinstated the book, we had to buy more copies to meet our holds to copies ratio. So we ended up with 3 times as many copies as we had anyways. And just to show that it ends on a pretty good note, at ALA, I got to meet Meier, and they were, to Dan, thank you for defending it, because I said, we're the library that removed your book, but we formed a new committee and put it back. So after we had just done that, we received another request for reconsideration for that book. And the woman had attached, because the lieutenant governor of North Carolina specifically had a list of 4 books that he mentioned, and that was written up in the Raleigh News Observer. She had photocopied the News Observer article and just on the form said, remove all these books. And that's all she wrote her name, but she didn't fill out the actual, did you read the book? What parts did you read? Is there anything of value in this book? Which pages specifically? She just wrote, remove all these books and paperclipped it. We just ignored it because she didn't fill out an actual request for reconsideration. So That's how we did that.
So, I'll move to a different topic. What do you do if a member of staff isn't able to community content or leadership? Like your board of trustees or your superintendent or someone else in the position of power. Or just our staff will do that.
So this is Kate. This actually happened in Wake County Public Libraries, and with a different book. And our take is that if you are a staff member, you are a Wake County community member, you're a Wake County citizen, you're a Wake County card holder. So if you are a staff member who takes issue with a book, you are welcome to fill out a request for reconsideration form. And we have had that happen. And the book has been through the request for reconsideration process. So that's how we handle it. Dan, do you want to add anything?
I'll just say, yeah, this is Dan, we follow the policy, so they can fill it out. It goes through the same process. We did that. I will say that was our only non-unanimous vote of the 9 that we've done this year. The book was Johnny the Walrus, the board book. So there were staff members who were opposed to the fact that that had been added to the collection, but our selection criteria, which is listed as part of the request for reconsideration policy, as well as the collection element policy, includes, demand for the book, and we received multiple patron requests for it. So our practice had been, if we receive one patron request for something, then you look at, professional reviews and all the other things and make a determination based on your own judgment. But we had been told by administration, if you're receiving multiple requests to add a book from patrons, then you really should add it because the community is asking for it. So staff was not happy about it. We do not agree with what's in the book, but that's what freedom of information is. So we put it through the process, and we ended up keeping it in the board book collection.
Can you repeat which book you were talking about? I'm sorry.
Johnny the Walrus.
So this is Karen. So we have had some issues with that where a media assistant didn't like a book. It was an LGBTQ, but it wasn't even an LGBTQ book. It was a book about 2 little boys that were best friends, and the little boy talked about how much he loved his best friend, and he liked to hold his hand, and he thought they were 6 years old. And so for me, the way I handle it is I empower the school librarians to be the leaders as that's their job. They are the experts in selection, and then also to reiterate that we are serving kids from all kinds of backgrounds. And second of all, to not overthink some of these books that are really just a pure innocent book, and you're making it more than what it really is. But I think empowering those school librarians to speak and advocate for their collections and their selection of books is very important. And keeping those books on the shelves. And that goes for whether it's their principal, whether it's a teacher, or whether it's a parent, but really, first of all, knowing their collection, but then secondly, being able to defend those choices of why they put those books on the shelf, and to understand the representation for all of our students is important, and that no parent has the right to say that another group should not be represented because you're about they don't align with their values. We've had that as well.
This is Valerie, and I think that goes back to building the relationship piece. There are going to be teachers in the building, there are going to be principals and admin who don't agree with particular books, or even, things you want up on your walls or whatever. But I think that building that relationship first helps with that, and then going back to educating them about what the library is for and how you select your books. I think it just goes back to that relationship building piece.
So this is my final question for the panel, but we'll have some time for questions in another minute. What advice would you give to our alumni and future alumni about keeping conversations civil, engaging, and continuing dialogue?
This is Valerie, I'm gonna just jump in because I'll forget it if I don't. So the Get Ready, Stay Ready toolkit, we are about to have a series of professional development with a crisis management organization. And so I think that those sessions are going to be really helpful for this conversation. So just staying, on the lookout for information about that. But then just not, it can be scary. It can be a scary time to just kind of go back to knowing that you are following policy, that you have been educated to select these books, to know what you're doing, you are the professionals, and to remember that. And then to just, kind of keep that in the back of your mind when you're talking to people, and again, building those relationships. I think that can be helpful when you're new, or even if you're not brand new, but just, keeping up with that information and, building relationships.
This is Karen. I'm going to second the building relationships. I think it's also trying to really bring that empathy. Like, even if you disagree with somebody, you can try to understand where they're coming from. And even if you don't understand, just accepting that they're coming from a very different viewpoint. And really trying, and this is probably my biggest one, is to not take it personally. And that's really hard. I had a situation a few months ago where a parent called me upset about a book they found in a book fair. Really upset. I mean, middle school parent didn't want to read the book because she didn't want the end brains, what she told me. Anyhow, she was yelling at me, told me that I was the reason, and then there were mass shootings. People like me were reason that there were mass shootings and school shootings, and I'm like, oh. So she ended up hanging up on me when she hung up. Like, I'm somebody that I have to really work not to take things personally. But I was like, she just needed somebody to yell at, and that was it for today. So I think it's that reiteration that this is not personal. Even though, it can feel like a personal attack. You're accusing me, then why? You don't know me at all. But just making sure that they know that it's not personal, and separating that your personal self from that professional life and decisions that you have to make. Also, some of the trauma-informed stuff that we talked about earlier, I think could really like this, because it is traumatic. When I got off the phone, I was shaking from head to toe. Didn't take it personally, but I was shook up. And of course, called somebody and just said, I have to tell you what happened. So some of that stuff from earlier, I think could really be beneficial in those types of situations.
I would just add from the public library side, if you find yourself in the position of having to defend the inclusion of a book that you don't agree with, that there's a chance you're going to have to do that, and that is not going to feel great. You're gonna question how you come across to your colleagues who are critical of the book. You're going to question how you come across to patrons, and I know I did. I certainly don't agree with what's expressed in Johnny the Walrus, but an email that I sent defending its inclusion in the collection ended up in the newspaper, and that was a really sucky moment, for lack of a better word. So just keeping that in mind.
This is Dan. I'll just second what you said about the trauma-informed session we had this morning was very helpful, because the whole process of creating the reconsideration process in the middle of that media attention and scrutiny and staff being upset, and that was pretty traumatic to go through. Yeah.
And I think the initial challenge is probably where you don't take it personally, but when it becomes an social media, then it becomes pretty personal. That's fine. And that's where we need the trauma there, and that we need our libraries to recognize that it is difficult, it is disheartening. You question whether or not you should be in the profession. It causes anxiety, falling sick a little bit. because it is so, you've got a sort of perfect storm of social media. And it all makes sense from happening all at the same time. So we're gonna thank you all very much. I really appreciate all your insights. So we've got a few minutes left that we can accept questions. If you've got questions, our lovely graduate assistants can bring in around microphones. You can still want to. And we also will take them from those of you who are online. If you've got questions, you can direct them to specific folks or to the panel.
I've never been a school teacher, so this is I just want to understand the situation. So right here at UNCG today is the North Carolina Conference for the PTA. And so it was on my mind, and I was wondering, is the PTA generally a friend or both?
This is Valerie. I think it can be both, but I think that is a great organization to be sharing information about their selection policies and about, if there are challenges happening, making sure that they are familiar with the process, and even going to their meetings when they have them, like something like whatever's happening today, and just saying, like, as library professionals, hey, can we just come and speak to your group about? But I think it can be both. But I think that if they know what you're doing, you can definitely be friends.
I'm going to second that. PTA, this is Karen. PTAs are often the ones that help book fairs. They're the ones that provide funding for libraries in a lot of schools that don't have funding from the principals. So they can be a great support, but they can also be a cliquish group of mostly women that can be the ones that drive some of those situations. But I'm going to agree with you that, getting them on your side, having those relationships with them, will also be the ones that will stand up and defend the right to access for students.
Hello, I am a LIS student. I'm just curious, so we obviously know what's happening for I'm just curious if you guys are concerned that those kind of procedures are going to happen in North Carolina, and if you guys have had any conversations about kind of preemptive planning for that kind of situation.
I can address that. This is April. Very concerned because we already have Senate Bill 49 that has passed through the Senate, and the House has in committee now. But that one actually will require disclosure of books that have been checked out. And there are lots of reasons why you would share information with parents, and there are also reasons why you wouldn't. Elementary kids have lost the book. They need to know what book it is. But I think these in middle and high school, and they're exploring their growing maturity, and they're becoming more independent. That could also be normal to a child to hear the parent is not as supportive of them exploring the world around them. So that is concerning, and the language from it is very similar. It also blocks any sexuality, gender, sexual activity discussions in kindergarten through 4th grade. So you can't talk about gender. Well, my friend who walks in with her wife, they're both women with their kids, and the kid says, so the law, the bill as it's written right now said, oh, you can mention it if someone asks you, but you can't teach anything about it. And my expectation is going to have that chilling effect that, that people won't add those books to the collection, that they won't, that it becomes this thing where people get reported. I mean, we've got in other states where they're going to criminalize teachers and school librarians who provide access to or content that they say is in our age inappropriate, which is a really bad term because it doesn't really mean anything.
This is Carrie. I just want to add on that. It's kind of with that Senate Bill 49. It is very, very scary. Currently, we don't save the information, and the law is kind of vaguely written to where if it's available, I can make sure it's not available. But there's another part of that bill that everybody should be aware of that talks about parents' rights, where if a student is, sharing that they might be gay or they might be having they might be transgender, that you're supposed to tell the parents. I personally, as an educator, would never out a student ever. I would lose my job before I outed a student. I think students will know who would out them and who would not, but it puts those LGBTQ students. I mean, I foresee, the suicide rate skyrocketing because now oftentimes your teachers and your school librarians are often those frontline people with it. They can no longer be trusted because of this law that's put into place that would force people, it's basically saying you have to out these kids. And to me, that is one of the most dangerous. A kid checks out, genderqueer, and suddenly you're like, oh, wonder if they're, have gender. What is the word they use? That they're not sure about their gender. They're questioning or whatever. Where does that put us as educators? It really breaks down relationships with kids, and these kids, home may not be a safe place, and now they're not even safe at school. So that part of that bill worries me more than the library. I hate the library part, but the safety of these kids concerns me more than anything.
This is Valerie to add a little bit more. There's bills like that in places in South Carolina too, and all over the nation. And I think one thing that we can do is just stay knowledgeable about the bills and speak out and go to public hearings when they happen. And that's really the best that we can do. And if they pass, the wording is ambiguous enough where I think that if we continue to educate our LIS students and then our current folks, hopefully they're, we feel like there are loopholes in place, but the main thing is that it's just the past, right? Like that's what we want. So just to stay knowledgeable about speaking to legislators and making sure they are aware of really the repercussions that passing these could have.
I would also say to you, if they do pass, that there might be some civil disobedience going on.
Librarians are supporters. I will also say that the Get Ready, Stay Ready toolkit has a legislative tracker on it, and Emily, my GA out there, she does the updates on it. And so we're tracking these bills all across the country so you can see what's happening. And we're all citizens. We should speak up. Don't use your official work email to do it. But we do need to speak up because we now have the U.S. House of Representatives that has passed the Parental Bill of Rights, and it goes to the Senate. I believe it will die in the Senate. It had bipartisan opposition in the House of those, but there are things that we can do as individuals, but also we need to enable our community members, empower our community members to speak up. And that means helping them understand the process of how do you meet with a representative, understanding where their local offices are. How do you get on the agenda for the school board? How do you put your name in to get that 3 minutes of speaking time? So helping our community know how they can act, I think is important. And the toolkit is going to be part of that. It's ready. It's getreadystayready.info. We'll be doing the training. Even if we don't get the grant, we're going to be doing this training. So we're doing a grant to try to get that funded. we're gonna do it.
And there's webinars on the site and definitely training will be taking place. But one thing that I wanted to say about this, we talked about the very loud vocal groups, right? That some of them are not even parents of certain communities, but they are the ones going to these hearings, and they're not the majority of like the people. If we all need to be vocal, not just the organized few, right? So I think it is really important. And then the Get Ready, Stay Ready toolkit, there is that legislative tracker, but there are also talking points and scripts. You don't have to do this and write your, it can be very scary, especially if it's not something that you've done before. You don't speak in front of folks very often. There are scripts there for you, so you don't even have to, come up with what you want to say on your own. You can use the resources that are available to you there.
Other questions?
Hi, have any students or patrons at either age expressed their thoughts or feelings about the book selection or banning situation, and how did you respond to them, or how would you respond to them?
This is Valerie, and I just want to point out there is a student group in Beaufort, South Carolina, DAYLO, and they have been doing a wonderful job being very vocal about their opposition to all of the censorship and banning, and they are actually going to be working on a segment in the Get Ready, Stay Ready toolkit for other student groups and young voices so that they can organize themselves to be more vocal, like this DAYLO group. And so, yes, I am familiar with this group, but there are other groups out there. I've seen in the news groups that are forming banned book clubs in their schools at their school level, like student-led student groups. So yes, and I think that is like where the most difference maybe can come from is getting your student groups to go speak to the legislator and school boards and, to the other educators in the building or the admin who may be opposed to having these resources, because those are the voices they need to hear. But then that can be scary for those students too. And so that aspect that DAYLO is going to be working on for the Get Ready, Stay Ready toolkit will be helpful. For students who may be scared, it's going to be very similar. They'll have scripts in place and just small things they can do, and then also bigger things they can do. But yes, I think getting student voice is very important.
So for the public library side, I'll say that any expression of interest in the collection from minors typically comes in a more passive way. We don't typically have, at least in my 10 years experience in Wake County, we don't have a lot of teenagers coming up to the desk and asking us about books. That's just not what my experience has been, but we can tell by holds ratios, by ebook checkout. Ebook checkout is a great metric of what our young patrons want to see. But typically, I have not seen young patrons coming to the desk to express concerns. I don't know if Dan wants to add anything. No.
I think in the schools, like they're communicating, especially middle schoolers and high schoolers are more likely to speak up. We have not in our district, because we haven't had any formal challenges, not really seen that, because to speak at a school board, it has to be on the agenda. You can't just go to the school board meeting and talk about books. It has to be on the agenda for the night. But I know in Guilford County, they had a really, it was just the board book. Anyhow, they had a challenge that was at the school level and ultimately went to the district level, and they had a large number of high school students that stood up and spoke for that. So the students are there and they're paying attention.
We also need to, we also need to not sweep things under the rug. And this is one of the issues that I've seen in a lot of school districts is administrators and leaders wanting you not to talk about this at all. not to inform teachers. This is taking place, or students, or anyone, and it is taking place, and the students need to be aware that they're going to be impacted by that. And so partnering with student groups just to talk about the issues they're seeing, they may not be impacted in the first bullets, but letting them know this is what's happening in our community, you can see this happening. And then partnering with student organizations that can be effective, GSA, Joint Alliances, and other organizations within your school. That a lot of them have activist training, and you can also support that. Things in your school.
And I'll just add one thing, kind of piggyback. With regards to public libraries, one thing that anyone can do is if your public library allows you to submit interest in a particular book that they don't own yet, definitely submit that, Dan can attest that we pay attention to those requests, and if requests to add books to the collection come through, they're considered.
And I'll also say that we have, as Dan, we have a very large number of patron material requests we receive. On an average year, we receive about 1,500, which works out to 30 new requests every workday. I have a staff of 3. So yeah, we do pay attention to that. We now have also worked with some folks internally to create a separate staff materials request system, separate from the patron ones. Staff felt that was very important, so we went ahead and honored that. And it's basically a Microsoft form that goes into a Microsoft spreadsheet, and they can give us more detail about why they think it's a good fit for the library, and then that also allows us to provide more explanation if we're not selecting it for the reason to really expand on that reason, because the patron one is done through our online catalog, their account, and if it's selected, you get an email saying it's selected. If it's declined because it's not available or out of print, our vendor doesn't carry it or it's out of print, it just says not available or out of print, and if it's declined for some other reason, it just says declined, and they don't get an email, so they have to go check their account. And then we have an online, ask us, and I get those requests, but nobody told me why it was declined. And so we have an FAQ online, so I have to send them that. But yes, materials requests can definitely influence the collection.
Thank you. One last call for questions. Do you have anything online? Oh, you have anything online? Okay, well, thank you all for being here today. We really appreciate it. And thank you for your questions and your attention.
Thanks very much. I have one more thing. I get out of that.
I'm sorry. Now I can get to you.
I have one more thing that I would really like to tell you and for you to help celebrate. We have a beloved faculty member whose contributions to this program I can't even begin to describe in the short amount of time I have. And she is entering phase retirement this year. So she'll be around for 3 more years and we'll celebrate her more fully later. But we're going to miss having you be a full faculty member. So please, Marguerite and that's we're going to miss you even more. Thank you all for being here. Yes. Oh, yeah. So September 8th. Is that right? Does anybody remember? I think it's September 8th. We are having incoming president, Emily Draminsky, come and spend the day with us. And we are thinking about maybe some kind of activist things that we might do while she's here. If you're not familiar with Emily, she is a very passionate defender of intellectual freedom, and she's going to do a great job as PLA president. So we're going to be really fortunate to have her. So mark your calendars. I'm not sure what shape the event will take, but she will be here that day, and I think it's gonna be really terrific, so. Anything else? Well, thank you so much for being here, it's just, and thank you to the panel, it was really terrific. And then we can take one. Let's now together, so thank you. You all have a good weekend.
Yes.
Me with Karen.